The day the wind carried the cedar's sharp smell down off the mesa, Tazbanez rose before the sun and found the sheep already restless, their soft bodies eddying around her legs like tide against a cliff. Dawn bled across the stone, painting the world in bands of rose and rust, and her shadow stretched long as a cottonwood across the frost-stiff earth. She was taller than most men, shoulders like quarried rock, and there was a steadiness in her that no one had ever shaken loose. She said it often and said it plain, mostly to teasing cousins, sometimes to the men who came sniffing around the corrals with two slick smiles. No man is strong enough for me. Not strong in the ways that count. Strength, as she measured it, was the grit to carry water for elders without being asked, the patience to lift a lamb gently from a tangle of prickly pear, the courage to speak soft and stand firm. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow, I have a special story for you. Her grandmother, Ashkenazi's widow, who everyone simply called Grandmother Willow, had once laughed and said, "Strength chooses where it lives, she has. My child. Sometimes it sits in a woman's bones and sometimes it borrows a man's hands. Either way, it must answer to the heart." Tazba's heart answered to the sheep, to her younger brother Len and her sister Nayli, into the small ancestral hogan their late father had timbered with his own chisel-scarred hands. The doorway faced east, as it must, and that morning the first sun stripes touched the red earth before the threshold and showed her two sets of tracks, a coyote's ghost steps, light as breath, and a boot print pressed deep where the soil was still damp from last night's thin rain. A stranger had come early. Not one of theirs, she would have recognized the imprint of elastics over worn moccasin soles. This was plain leather, heel ground down on the outside, square toe. Cowboy. She didn't like that. Len came barreling from behind the corral with a bucket that sloshed on his pant leg. He was 12 and quick as a rabbit when he wanted to be, a boy who could climb a juniper with a knife in his teeth and come down with a bundle of straight arrow shafts. Taz. There's a horse at the South Spring. A horse like ours? A horse like nobody's. Gray as old smoke, tail like my new rope. Drop the bucket, she said, already moving. Grandmother Willow? From inside, her grandmother's voice floated out with the smell of coffee and blue corn mush. I'm listening. Don't scare the sheep. Don't scare yourself. I never do, Tazba replied, but she touched the carved prayer stick by the door with her fingertips all the same, honoring the morning in the way her father had taught, quietly, without spectacle. She slung a coil of rope over her shoulder, checked the knife at her belt, and started toward the South Spring. Around her, the land woke by degrees, a canyon wren's falling whistle, the hush of a breeze that felt like a hand smoothing a child's crown, the sun pushing its bright weight over the sandstone rim. She moved like she belonged to it, and in truth she did, born where the red rock held stories older than thunder, raised on songs that braided sky and sheep and human breath into one long rope of belonging. The South Spring lay in a shallow bowl beneath a shelf of rock, ringed with willows that kept their music even when the wind slept. The gray horse stood streaming and alert beside the water. He was taller than any Mustang she'd seen, with a Roman nose and dapples like rain shadows. A rope halter hung from his neck, but the lead was gone, and a fresh welt banded his shoulder as if someone had pulled him hard against a post and he hadn't forgiven the pull. Tazba clicked her tongue softly. Ayu Ananishni, she murmured, a greeting, not claiming but acknowledging. The horse's ears pricked, he blew his breath and shifted his weight. You speak to him like you've known him all your life, a voice said from the willow shade. Do that with people, too? She turned. The man who stepped from the willows wore dust the way other men wore pride, like it kept him upright. He wasn't old, but he'd ridden further than the calluses on his hands could account for. Tall, but even in that first glance she measured him as shorter than her by the span between knuckles. His hat brim was cracked, one spur was missing rowels, and his eyes had a tired kindness she distrusted more than anger. He kept his hands where she could see them. Name's Coulter Ash, he said. Not common, and the syllables were clean like creek water. I believe you found my horse. The spring found him, she replied. And he found us. Fair, he conceded easily. Still, I'd like to take him off your water and back on my trail. He doesn't mean to trespass, Miss Mississippi. The word sat wrong. In Dine, names carried place and clan like a map. He hadn't asked for hers. He had, however, asked the horse's permission with his eyes without thinking she could see him do it. She did. She saw everything. You pulled him into a post, she said, nodding to the welt. A corner of his mouth twitched. I did not. Another fella did. I took exception on the horse's behalf, which is why the horse is here and the fella who thought a post would win an argument is somewhere with a mouth full of dust. Because you hit him? Because his face and the ground suddenly agreed to meet. Tazba didn't smile, though something bright moved in her chest and she tamped it down. This water is for everyone who asks politely. Even men. Let him easy. He has opinions. My horse, Coulter said, deadpan, has more opinions than the state of New Mexico. They watched one another while the gray drank. Tazba noted how Coulter turned his body slightly so he blocked the wind from the horse's flank, how he kept his left hand low and open, how he never once reached for the bridle like a man trying to prove he had a right to it. Where are you headed? She asked. West until my money's honest, he said. North when the grass says so. South if a storm beats me to the pass. East when the horse changes his mind. A man without a home, she said, not unkindly. A man whose home is attached to this side of a Mustang, he countered. She tipped her head toward the Hogan whose smoke thread lifted over the ridge. We have a home. We have water. We don't have patience for cowboys who come empty and leave lighter. Then I'll leave heavy, he said, and the words would have been insolent from another man. From him, they sounded like someone trying to make a joke in a church because he didn't know where to put his hands. Pay your water with work, she said, because she believed in exchanges that meant more than coins. Help me set a new fence line on the west shear. The lambs try it every morning. If you can keep one lamb from dying stupid, you and your horse can drink until the sun's too tired to look. Deal. He tied the gray to a willow, careful, and came along without swagger. As they climbed the low rise toward the west fence, Len and Naley appeared like larks from the sage, their braids flapping, their eyes devouring this new person in their world. This is Coulter Ash, Tazba said. He knows how to listen to horses and pay debts. Naley, sharp-eyed and already more serious than a girl of 9 should be, squinted at the missing rowel. He also doesn't finish what he starts. Coulter tapped his empty spur. Sometimes a thing finishes itself before it knows what it is. That's not how spurs work, Naley muttered, unimpressed. Len made a sound like a smothered laugh. They worked. The morning grew hotter, sun pouring into the pockets of the earth until the rock smelled like iron. Coulter dug post holes and never once asked for a shorter shovel. Tazba tamped and tested and had him move two that didn't satisfy her. He didn't sulk, and he didn't preen when she approved. He just wiped his brow and looked at the line from a lamb's height to make certain he understood the world in sheep measurements. Men from the cattle company came late morning, 3 of them riding a red stallion, a dun mule, and a chestnut with its head bound too tight. Their shirts matched, and so did their expressions, flat-eyed, cheeks burned red not from sun but from believing themselves invincible. They didn't greet. They didn't dismount. They looked at the posts like they were a problem to be shot at. Fence looks new, the lead man said, voice the color of old pennies. It is, Tazba replied. She didn't fold, she rose taller. A hawk shadow slid over the ground, and she stood like a piece of the mesa had decided to try legs for the day. You know company land starts at the arroyo, he said. I know the water starts upstream, she said. Your sheep cross that fence, we take him, he went on. Your brother crosses that fence, we teach him a lesson. Your horse, his eyes cut to the gray at the springs, then to Coulter's missing spur. We teach that horse to mind a post. Coulter didn't move his hand, but Tazba felt the air change around him, a draw tightening without the gun. She lifted a palm, no, and stepped forward. Your company's mark doesn't float on water, she said. And it doesn't break the sky. We share. Or you dry. The lead man tried a smile on her that fit like a dead squirrel. You a big one, aren't you? I fill my own bones, she said. You fill a man's dream, you know that? Then his dream is small. The dun mule pinned its ears as if embarrassed for its rider. The lead man's eyes cooled. Keep your lambs to your side. We'll be back to count. Count to what? Len asked from behind the fence. His voice trembled, but he made it carry. Count to 3, the lead man said, turning his horse. We don't like counting high. They left dust and the smell of arrogance. Coulter watched them with that tired kindness she disliked, because it meant he understood the cost before it came due. How often? He asked. Enough, Tasba answered. They measure the world in fences and think their fences are the world. Sometimes fences keep wolves out, he said. Sometimes fences make wolves hungry, she returned. They finished the line. Naley brought a gourd of water that tasted of cold stone and nothing else. Grandmother Willow set a pot of mutton stew on the coals by the hogan, and the air grew soft around the house. In the shade of the cottonwood, they ate with quiet conversation, the kind that keeps people stitched together. How many new lambs, which coyote track was freshest, whether the white corn had sulked or sung under last night's brief rain. Coulter told a small story about a river farther west that braided itself like a girl's hair. Len asked too many questions and learned 3 ways to hear the difference between hooves and a storm on rock. Naley listened and judged and then asked, unexpectedly, if a horse chooses to stay where he isn't owned, is he stealing? Coulter chewed, considered. Maybe he's paying kindness forward. Maybe he's a better neighbor than his man has been. Tasba let the stew sit on her tongue without swallowing. She realized then that she did not want to like anything about this man. She did not want to like that he thanked the food aloud without flourish. She did not want to like that he noticed when Grandmother Willow shifted her sore knee and moved the basket closer without making a show. She did not want to like that he laughed with his whole face at Len's jokes but didn't dare laugh at Naley's because Naley's weren't jokes at all. She set her bowl aside and rose. I'm taking the herd to the high bench, she said. Grass is sweeter there today. I'll ride away with you, Coulter said, not pretending it was his right. You'll want one more pair of eyes until the company men decide whether to count or to pretend they can. Grandmother Willow watched them with a look that was part storm reading and part blessing. Don't bring back trouble unless it's the kind you can teach, she told Tasba. The only trouble worth carrying, Tasba said, and she set out. They moved up through the juniper and pinyon, the sheep bobbing like pale stones in a river of brush. The gray horse, Coulter called him Ordway, which was a ridiculous name for an animal with that much opinion, kept his distance from the herd because he respected jobs and knew his wasn't to be a sheepdog. Ordway, she said finally, because it had become a pebble in her boot. It's a town where I lost and found myself in the same afternoon, Coulter said. Seemed fair to give the name to something better than I am. You say a lot of things like they're jokes, she said. If I don't, they sit too heavy, he said. Weight builds muscle, she countered. And breaks backs, he said gently. The bench opened like a palm. Grass stood thicker, silver green in the light, and the herd settled to their work with a relief that hummed through their bodies into the ground. Wind moved over them and drew a shiver from Tasba's skin where sweat had dried. She stood and watched and counted without thinking, this ewe, this lamb, that goofy wether that always forgot he had legs until the last second. She felt Coulter's gaze like heat on rock. You count like you're praying, he said. I count like I refuse to lose what I love, she replied. A raven croaked overhead. Far off, thunder stitched itself into the horizon, not a threat yet but a promise that a different hour would come. Storm, Coulter said. Late, she answered. We can make the siphon gulch and back before it breaks. The siphon? A narrow belly of rock. Water gathered there even in bad years. Company men like to boast they control it by controlling the approaches. And do they? The rock doesn't listen to boasting, she said. But men do. Men get scared by a man who points and counts. You really don't think any man's strong enough for you, he said. He wasn't taunting. He was asking what lay under her words like a miner tapping a beam. She turned to him, measured him head to boots. I think strength bends when it must and stands when it should and knows the difference. I haven't met many men who know the difference. He nodded like she'd put a stone exactly where his hand had reached. Maybe you haven't, he said. Maybe you have and didn't like that it carried a man's face. Is this a preacher talking from under a cowboy hat? This is a man who's learned the hard way what breaks and what holds. Have you learned how to listen to a woman who has learned the same? Trying, he said, and there was something so straightforward about it that her chest did that bright thing again, and again she tamped it down. They pushed the herd across the bench and into the throat of the gulch. Walls rose on either side, sandstone smoothed by centuries of water's patient argument with stone. The herd funneled, clacking small stones, moving like a single creature with many heads. Tazba's rope coiled and uncoiled in her hands, habit, rhythm, readiness. Halfway in, the wind died. Sound sharpened, the slip of a hoof, the creak of leather, the raven's voice dropping like a stone. Tazba's skin answered before her mind had the word. She glanced up to the rim. Men. Not the three from morning. For now. One at the mouth of the gulch, two along the rim where the rock winged out into shelves like sleeping shoulders, and one, she swallowed, already inside the gulch behind a kink in the wall where the shadow lay heavy. They had rifles. The one below had a club. Coulter breathed in like a man stepping into cold water. Options, he said, voice low. You follow me, she said. You do exactly what I say. If I tell you to put your face in the sand, you put it there and make friends with ants. Ants and I are on speaking terms, he said. She slipped to the front before the herd could bunch in panic. Panic in a slot will stack you like firewood and count your ribs for you. She lifted her hand and the lead ewes eased, puzzling out her ask, slowing like obedient thoughts. A man's voice came off the rock above and fell to them like a bad joke. Afternoon, he called. Tight place for a stroll. Water place, Tazba returned. We're sharing. Company changed policy, he said. Policy says girls don't walk through without paying toll. Policy says boys pay double. Policy says anybody taller than my hat owes me something I can spend. If your hat is the measure of the world, Tazba said, it's a small world. The man with the club stepped from the shadow like a coyote that had learned English. He smiled with all his teeth showing. She talks pretty, he said. I like him that way. Mouth keeps moving when you set the rest of her still. Coulter's hand twitched toward the knife on his hip and then stilled when he felt her stillness beside him, still not afraid but choosing, still like a bow pulled to the notch. You have a mother, Tazba said to the club man without raising her voice. You have a sister or a cousin who plaited your hair when you were small. Somewhere you have a grandmother who taught you which plants burn your tongue and which make it sweet. Does your policy talk to them when it's done talking to me? The man blinked, confusion opening in his eyes like a door to a room he hadn't known existed. The one on the rim with the rifle scoffed. Don't listen, hoot. She's a fence and a dress. You climb it or you cut it. Nothing else to do. Then here's my policy, Tazba said. She turned her head just enough to catch Coulter's eye. You'll be my right arm. When I move, you move. Yes, ma'am, he murmured, and there wasn't a lick of mockery in it. She spread her hands, rope loose, stance easy, and began to walk straight at Hoot like he'd invited her to dinner and she intended to bring a heavy dish. He lifted his club, uncertain now, her size did that to men who lacked imagination. They thought in two measures, smaller or bigger. They forgot about truer. Stop right there, the man on the rim called, rifle steady. Or I make you slow with a bullet. Do it, Tazba said without looking up. You'll kill sheep. Then you'll climb down into a panic. Then you'll learn how a mother you uses her skull when you stand where she doesn't want you. My brother's skull is stronger. Your brother, the man behind them said. He had moved when their attention had risen. He was closer now, too close to Len. Len, Tazba said without turning her head, to me. He began to move, and the man's club rose. Coulter moved first. Not with a boast and not with a shout, he stepped like he intended to sweep dust, body low, one hand closing around Hoot's ankle with a twist that made the big man's balance vanish like a trick coin. Hoot hit the ground hard, the club fell and bounced, a lamb bleated at the sound and the herd rippled in place. The rifle cracked from the rim, the bullet snapped rock where Tazba's shoulder had just been. She didn't flinch, she adjusted, a subtle re-aiming like wind correcting its course around a boulder. She caught the club before it finished bouncing, spun it once to feel its temper, and planted its head in the sand as if she were setting a new fence post between her and the man with the rifle. "Next shot will kill your water," she said to the rim. "You miss me again, you hit the spring vein and then your company will sell dust in bottles." "Shoot her," the lead man snarled. He had moved down to the mouth of the slot and his voice pinballed off stone ugly as a bruise. "Shoot me," Tazba said. "Then your men climb down and learn what strong means." She didn't shout the word. She gave it weight. The herd pressed, a soft but enormous suggestion of force. Tazba felt it like tide. She kept her body between the panic and the narrow tooth of rock that would break them if they pushed. "Len. Nayli. Hands on wool. Talk to them." They did. Children's voices, close and urgent, telling ewes they were good mothers, telling lambs to remember they had legs. "Ma'am," Coulter said quietly, eyes still on Hoot who writhed and tried to find his feet. "There's a way through them without losing any sheep." "Say it," she said. "Not with words. With my back." He turned and put himself where bullets wanted to go, making his body a fence that did not cut but guided. Tazba's throat tightened and she didn't know why, because this was a simple thing and men did simple, decent things all the time, and she'd said no man was strong enough, but here was a man choosing the strong thing that cost him and asked nothing in return. "Go," she said, and the word carried more than permission. It carried trust, which is heavier than a club. They moved. The herd flowed around Hoot where he still flailed, around Coulter's braced legs, around Tazba's steady hands, and when the man at the rim shouted again he sounded smaller, a leader watching the river rearrange the banks he thought were stone. Another shot. This one hissed past Coulter's hat and tore a hole in the brim that let sun through in a bright coin. He didn't so much as tilt his head. "Stop shooting," the man behind Len snapped, anger not righteous but scared now. "You're going to stampede them and then we're all dead." "Not if we get paid first," the lead man called, but the call had softened. A different calculus was doing work in his skull, the kind that hears children's voices and a grandmother's ragged cough from far away and remembers being 12 with a bucket and a sister's hand on your collar. They slid past, feet kicking up grit, sheep hooves tapping rock, the gulch narrowing to a place where even breath had to turn sideways to pass. Tazba kept the club's head buried in her palms open. Hoot, panting and furious, found his knees and then froze when he saw her watching him like a teacher who would accept any answer except cruelty. "You could kill me," he said. "You're big enough to pick me up and break me." "Strength doesn't break," she said. "It carries where it must." "Then carry this," he spat, and his hand flashed toward his belt. Tazba knew the shape of the movement before the blade gleamed. She stepped into it, not away. Her forearm met his wrist and the knife skated harmlessly along the leather wrap she wore when working wire. She heard Coulter swear softly, not at Hoot, but at the physics of men who learn the wrong lessons too early. Hoot twisted, face gone stubborn and child vicious, and Tazba did what her father had taught her to do when a lamb got its head stuck between corral boards. She turned what was stuck further before easing it back the right way. Hoot's elbow popped as it folded, the knife dropped, and she caught it and pinned it in the sand beside the club without so much as raising a welt. "Stay down," she said. "Learn something while you're there." Len's eyes were too wide. Nayli's mouth was an angry line, but her small hands stayed on warm wool and did not let fear steal their work. They reached the vein where water seeped clean from stone into a cupped basin. The herd drank with that holy silence animals have when they remember water is the only word that matters. Tazba knelt and let the cool run over her knuckles. She stared at her own hands and saw them without pity, large, scarred, steady, made to hold as much as made to lift. Coulter knelt a pace away. He didn't speak. The man on the rim did not shoot. Hoot stayed down and breathed like a bellows. The one at the mouth of the slot stepped back a step and then another, as if he'd suddenly remembered his own grandmother's voice. Grandmother Willow's cough came into Tazba's memory like a wind through brush. She rose. "We're done," she told the men, "no threats, no bargain. We'll pass again when we will. If you've learned to count higher by then, we'll share the numbers." The lead man said nothing. The raven set arc and flew toward the east as if delivering a message on black wings. They took the herd out as the first rumble of the storm put its shoulder against the far horizon. On the bench, wind came up sudden and full of grit. The sheep flattened their ears and picked their way with the weather sense written into their bones. Halfway across, Nayli grabbed Tazba's sleeve. "Len," she said, and the name ripped small and scared from her throat. Len had ranged ahead to where the bench broke into a low shelf and then the shallow beginnings of a wash. He'd found a knot of lambs huddled behind a tumble of brush and was easing them out with quiet talk and patient fingers. He was good, so good, and he was also standing on a slab that had undercut since the last flood. Tazba saw the new fissure spidering under the surface like a crack in glass. She saw the way the stone flexed when he shifted his weight. "Len," she said, calm and warning together. "Freeze." He froze. The lambs didn't. One bolted. Len's body obeyed the kindness that came before thought. He reached. And the slab moaned. "Don't move," Coulter said, voice gone flat with a kind of brightness that had nothing to do with sun. He was already unslinging a coil of rope from his saddle horn. "Ordway, hold." The gray planted his feet. Wind shoved them and then shoved again. The storm had picked up speed, galloping it across open miles the way storms do when they have somebody particular to find. Tazba took the rope from Coulter's hands without asking and tied it around her waist with a knot that wouldn't let go until she told it to. "Anchor me," she said. "I'm heavier." "You're taller," he said. "I'm heavier in the way that matters." "What way is that?" "The stupid way," he said, and he grinned, but his eyes were iron. He looped the rope around his chest and hips, braced against Ordway's saddle, and dug his heels into the earth like a tree deciding to grow in a bad place because someone needed shade right now. "Len," Tazba said again, making her voice a blanket. "Look at me." He did. He was the color of chalk. "I didn't mean." "I know what you meant," she said. "And I love what you meant. Now do what I say." "Yes." "Put your left foot where your right foot is," she instructed. "Slow. Toe down like you're testing a creek with a frog in it." He did. The slab complained. The fissure whitened. "Again," she said, and moved 3 steps closer herself, distributing the weight of her fear across her bones where it couldn't shake. The herd rippled, uneasy. Nayli stood like a post, holding the flock's curiosity in check with only her spine and the size of her will. She was small, and she was a wall. "Another step," Tazba said. A lamb bawled. Wind tore the sound away. "Another," she said. Len lifted his foot, set it down, and the world beneath him let go. He dropped with a sound like someone tearing cloth, arms pinwheeling, eyes huge and bright, hands grabbing nothing but air. The rope went tight in Tazba's hands and her feet slid, then bit, and she felt in her body what she had always said with her mouth: strength doesn't break, it carries. "I've got you," she said, and her voice didn't shake. "I've got you," Coulter said behind her, and his voice didn't shake either. Len swung in open space where the wash had carved a shallow throat. He kicked and found nothing. Sand rattled down around him like dry rain. The edge under Tazba's boots crumbled by inches. "Don't climb," she told him. "Hang. Let me do the work." He stopped thrashing. He trusted. It hit her in the chest, a blow as clean and as hard as anything she'd ever taken, and for a second the world went white at the edges because trust that unguarded feels like standing in front of a storm without a coat and finding out you didn't need one after all. She dug her heels and lowered slowly, the rope screaming a little where grit found it, her palms burning under the leather, sweat running cold down her sides despite the heat. She could see Len's face now, the stubborn love in it, the apology. "Hold my eyes," she said. "Not the edge." "Me." He did. He always did what she told him. He would do it all his life if she asked. The thought terrified and steadied her at once. "Reach," she said, and he did, fingers catching her wrist, his weight a separate truth her arm accepted without argument. "Now my forearm. Now my elbow. Now." The ground under her boots lurched. Coulter's grunt came behind her, an animal sound from a man forcing his muscles to remember all the things hunger and long miles had tried to make them forget. Ordway slid half an inch and then sat back on his haunches like a dog who had decided this was his job and he would not fail it. "I can't hold her," Naley said through clenched teeth, but she wasn't talking about her sister. She was talking about the herd's fear, about the way panic moves like lightning through animals when one of their own hangs over a mouth in the earth. "You can," Tazba said, not looking. "Because you are me when I am not there." Naley made a sound that was not a sob and not a laugh and somehow both. The lambs stilled. The ewes lowered their heads and muttered sheep prayers. The wind took its hands off Tazba's back for one merciful heartbeat. "Now," she said to Len, and he surged that last small distance, and her arm took him like the land takes rain, and then they were a pile of knees and elbows and rope and grit on solid ground while sand and rock and the lamb that had bolted fell past into the wash with a heavy whomp. Tazba rolled to her back and stared at the sky. The first cold drop of rain hit her cheek. Then another. "You all right?" Coulter asked, breath hitching, voice raw with the cost of choosing the strong thing. "Yes," she said, and then she realized she was crying, and she did not care, because she was strong enough to cry and lift and laugh all at once. Len made a sound like a broken whistle and then like a new one, and he wrapped his skinny arms around her neck and made himself small again the way he had when he was 3 and wolves were only stories and the dark had no mouth. "Thank you," she said to Coulter without turning, because turning would have made it too much. "For being the stupid kind of heavy." "My pleasure," he said, and if a man can smile without moving his mouth, he did. They got their feet under them. The rain came proper now, hard and fast, flattening greasewood, making the earth release its long-held scent. The storm had arrived at a gallop and would leave the same way, but the minutes in between would be dangerous, the kind of flood that kills sheep and men who think they can outrun it. "Move," Tazba said, and Naley didn't need the word. She was already swinging the herd toward higher ground, body small and iron, hair plastered to her skull. Len ran light at Tazba's side, voice steady because she needed it steady. Behind them, thunder cracked like a tree splitting. Tazba looked over her shoulder and saw a wall of brown water shouldering its way down the wash, hungry, carrying branches and stones and a tumble of something that could have been brush and could have been the color of a man's shirt. "Faster," she said, and the herd proved it had learned her voice better than fear. They surged up the slope in a slither of hooves that would have looked like panic if it hadn't been so beautifully obedient. Halfway up, a shape jerked on the far bank, hooed, mud to his chest, eyes wild, club long gone, fingers digging at slick clay that would not be held. He saw Tazba seeing him and screamed something that wasn't a word at all. "Leave him," Coulter said, and he said it like a man who had learned that some floods don't forgive and some rescues become funerals. "No," Tazba said, already untying the rope. "He's got a grandmother." "I know," Coulter said, and his hands were on the rope with hers before the last letter of no finished leaving his mouth. "Ordway." The horse laid his ears and took his weight again like a saint asked to be a mule. "You aim," Coulter said. "I'll throw." She aimed with her eye in her breath and a strange new trust that flowed between her and this man like a river that had been underground for miles and decided to surface where two people stood together. He threw with a grace that proved he hadn't been joking when he said most of what he knew about home lived at the end of a rope. The line fell sweet across Hoot's chest. He clawed it into his armpits and howled when the flood took his legs. The rope went steel hard. Tazba and Coulter and Ordway became 3 knots in one cable, the earth moved under their boots, the wash screamed its rage, and Hoot came up the bank in a series of jerks that put a decade of humility into each foot of ground he gained. He collapsed on his belly, coughed up a pint of mud, and began to sob like a boy who had not meant to be a man in the first place. Tazba let him do it. She didn't offer a hand and she didn't offer a word. Some lessons need the quiet to ring. Go, Coulter said softly, and this time when he spoke she let him bend her will toward the thing they both knew had to happen next. Water's not done. We take your people first. Her people. The words punched the breath out of her and put it right back in, larger. They drove the herd over the lip of the bench and onto the slope above the hogan where the ground lifted in a wide shoulder safe from sudden water. Grandmother Willow stood in the door, shawl over her head, calm as any sunrise. When she counted and saw that the number matched the feeling in her bones, she nodded once to the sky as if to thank it for being a good teacher today. Hoot staggered up behind them like a lesson that hadn't finished yet. He kept his eyes down. Rain slicked his hair to his skull and made his cheeks clean in streaks. You'll go back to your men, Tazba told him. You'll tell them what you learned. What I learned, he rasped, disbelief raw. That you could have let me drown? That a fence isn't the same thing as a wall, she said. And a woman isn't a door you get to lock. He swallowed, words stuck, then nodded once, hard. I'll tell them, he said. Good, she said, and turned away so her tears would be clean with rain and not with pity. Len wrapped his arms around Grandmother Willow's waist and shook like a lamb that remembers the wolf only after it's safe. Nayli leaned against Tazba's hip and did not cry, because Nayli kept the world on its tracks by the point of her chin and would not let it tip when people needed both hands for other things. Coulter stood at the edge of the slope, looking toward the gulch. The storm was breaking already, shouldering itself into the east and leaving the land rinsed and raw. His hat hung down his back by its stampede string, his hair was the color of winter grass and stuck to his jaw. His shoulders made a shape in the rain that felt like a new kind of truth, a strong thing that had chosen where to live and had decided that place was beside hers. You paid for the water, Tazba said without looking at him. Water paid for me, he said, and the sentence surprised them both. He shook his head like the gray when a fly landed wrong. I'd better take Ordway down and make sure the fence line didn't wash. You'll want the west sheer tight before night. She wanted to say 100 things and none of them were the right size. I'll walk with you, she said. Len needs to learn the river's voice after a storm, and you need to learn my land says what it means out loud. They went together, the three of them, while Nayli stayed to help Grandmother Willow set new wood and sweep mud from the hearth and sing the low, practical songs that women sing when hunger has been delayed but not abolished. The gulch had changed in the way water changes things, subtle and absolute. The undercut slab had gone, the place where Len had hung was now a polished throat, the vein ran brighter, as if laughter had found it. Hoot had not followed. The men on the rim were gone. A single boot track showed where someone had stood, uneasy, and then decided he'd stood long enough. They checked the fence. It held. A few posts leaned like old men considering the afternoon, and Coulter set his shoulder to one and pushed it true without being asked. Len watched and imitated and then tried to outdo, because that's how boys learn to be good men when good men stand where boys can see them. You were wrong, Coulter said, and the sentence landed like rain on a hot rock, unexpected and exactly right. About what? Tazba asked. No man is strong enough for you, he said. It's not a true sentence. It's half true. You're bold to correct a woman who just hauled a boy out of a hole where you would have fit like a coin. He shrugged. Half the time, boldness is how I state my fear without stuttering. He put his palms on the top rail and looked across the rinsed land. No man alone is strong enough for you, he said. But a man who chooses to stand beside you until the choice costs him, that man might be. And if he isn't yet, he will be. She did not answer. Her throat hurt with things she had decided, once, never to say aloud because once you say a thing it grows teeth or wings or both. She looked at Len, at his narrow back bent over a post that weighed almost as much as he did, and she thought, strength isn't a contest, it is a covenant. Thunder shelved itself away into blue distance. The raven returned and sat on the fence and looked at them as if to say, I'm not judging, but I am memorizing. They stood like that, 3 figures in a world scrubbed to clean color, when a rider crested the far ridge at a lope, then another behind him, then 3 more across the flank where the pinion gave way to open stone. Dust rose under their horses even though the rain had laid dust like a kindly hand. Coulter's body went quiet beside her the way a river's surface goes smooth when the depth underneath runs fast. "Not the morning men," he said. "Different hats. Different way of sitting a saddle." "Company?" Tazba asked. "No," he said. "Worse." The riders spread in an easy fan and came down the grade like they owned gravity. The one in front lifted a gloved hand in a greeting that wasn't quite a greeting. He had a broken nose that had healed sideways and a mouth like a scar drawn too long. On his duster's breast, a brand had been sewn in thread that wanted to be gold when it grew up. His horse moved with a violence it had learned not from spurs but from boredom. Coulter took a half step left and put himself between the riders and Len without making a speech about it. Ordway blew and lifted his head and decided he was a wall today and would take the consequences like a tree takes wind. "We're looking for a man," the lead rider said when he was close enough to count eyelashes. "Name of Ash." Coulter didn't answer. Tazba did. "This land listens to women before men," she said. "Say your name to me first." The rider's smile weighed nothing and still landed heavy. "Tell your land the name is Brighton Cobb," he said. "Tell it I buy what I want and move what I don't." "And if the land doesn't want you?" she asked. "Then I teach it manners," he said. Len's breath hitched almost imperceptibly. Brighton Cobb tipped his chin at Coulter. "You owe me a horse," he said, lazy. "Gray. Ugly. Answers to Ordway when he wants. And you owe me for the hand whose teeth the ground counted on your behalf." Coulter still didn't move, and Tazba realized the stillness in him had shifted. It wasn't fear and it wasn't anger. It was a readiness that included her. He wasn't putting his body in front of hers because he thought she needed shielding. He was taking a position beside her because together was the only configuration that made sense anymore. "No man is strong enough for me," she said clearly, letting Brighton's men hear it. "But a woman and a man who've chosen where to stand, that is a different math." Brighton laughed like a man who thought arithmetic was for people who couldn't afford guns. He swept his hat from his head in a mockery of politeness and showed hair oiled into obedience. "You talk pretty," he said, the same ugliness Hood had tried but with a flourish that had cost more money and less soul. "Let's make a trade, pretty talk." "The horse for the boy." "Which boy?" Tazba asked, and her voice was rock. "The small one with the clean fear," Brighton said, tasting the words. "Fear's a fine thing in a boy. Breaks easy, sets hard. Makes a man who doesn't ask questions when you ask him to pull a rope." Len made a small sound and tried to bury it in his chest. Tazba felt it across the air between them the way you feel the first tick of a rattler before you see the coil. "No," she said, and the word landed like a fence post driven straight into bedrock. Brighton's smile went thinner. "You misunderstand. I wasn't asking. And I wasn't answering a question," she said. "I was telling the weather what it may and may not do." Brighton leaned forward in the saddle, easy, bored, dangerous. "Ash," he said, almost kindly. "If you don't hand me the lead rope on that gray and step aside, I will cut a lesson into this land that all your pretty words can't heal." Coulter's hand found the fence rail. He did not squeeze. He did not shake. He said, softly, as if reminding himself, "A fence isn't the same as a wall," and then he looked at Tazba like a man inviting a partner into a dance he'd never learned but wanted to. She nodded once. "Stand where you are," she said. Brighton raised 2 fingers. His men spread further, circling like wolves who'd been given permission to be themselves. One of them lifted a rifle without hurry and sighted along it at Len's narrow back where it bent over the good post he'd just set straight. The breath went out of the day. "Taz," Coulter said, but he did not finish her name because the rifle cracked, sharp and sure, and the world started to fall. This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now, back to the story. Fall. The sound that pushed the word through Tazba's skull was not the tidy crack she'd heard in small arroyos when boys played at war with willow switches, it was the hard flat slap of an iron decision. She didn't think. Bodies that have carried lambs through flood learn to move before thought puts a clumsy boot where grace belongs. She threw her shoulder into Len and the world tilted, fence rail, dust, Brighton Cobb's smile thinning to a knife edge, Coulter's hand cutting air as if he could palm the bullet and hand it back. The shot tore splinters from the top rail where Len's neck had been a heartbeat ago. Splinters kissed her cheek like angry bees. Len's breath hitched, one shocked rabbit sound, and then steadied because she stole her own fear to feed him calm. "Down," she said, and her voice was dry sage and wet stone and the promise that held a roof on in wind. Coulter didn't ask. He moved with her, not ahead of her, not behind. They became a hinge and the herd became a door they swung toward the hill. Ordway planted his weight so completely into the earth that the earth grunted approval. Brighton laughed once, short and pleased with himself for remembering where laughter fit in a cruelty. His man with the rifle snapped the bolt like he was cracking a chicken bone at supper and lifted the sight to his eye again. "Put it down," Coulter called, and the man ignored him, because men with rifles learn to ignore voices until a different voice, closer and lower, changes the story. Tazba stood. She did not stand like a woman daring a bullet, she stood like a piece of mesa that had been told to be polite and had decided, for the length of a breath, to forget how. Shoulders squared to the shooters, palms open to her own fear, she set her boot on the bottom rail and leaned her weight forward until the wire sang a low complaining note. "My brother is not a trade," she said. Her words fell heavy, the fence sang again underfoot. The sound threaded through the men's muscles the way a mother's hum lays a hand on a child's wild heart. The rifleman's cheek barely left the stock. "Tell her to move," he said to Brighton, impatient. "Or I move her." Brighton's eyes narrowed, not at Tazba, but at Coulter, as if she were a road and Coulter was the river he meant to dam. "Ash," he said. "I'm a buyer. I buy outcomes. Don't make me waste daylight auctioning your pride." Coulter dipped his head once and put his palm to the fence rail beside Tazba's boot. He pressed, and the wire gave enough to wobble the rifleman's sight line by the thickness of a thumb at 20 yards. That was enough. "Len," Tazba said, and felt him slide away behind her knee. "Nayli, keep him smaller than his fear." "I am," Nayli said, and made it true by standing like a stake in a windbreak, small and absolute. Grandmother Willow's shawl moved at the Hogan door, the old woman did not step out, wisdom knows when to stay inside a prayer. Brighton's patience thinned. "Bring me the gray," he told the man to his right, without removing his eyes from Tazba. "The woman's a tree. We'll tie the rope to her shade." "No," Coulter said, steady, almost gentle. "No you won't." Brighton's horse sidestepped at something in Coulter's voice. The lead rider's mouth ticked. "You think I won't hurt a woman?" "I think you don't know what you're standing in front of," Coulter said. He didn't look at Tazba when he said it, and that was the first gift, he let her be herself without making it a stage. "Men who talk like that," Brighton said, talk to the ground with their teeth a minute later. He lifted his fingers, a signal formed in a dozen such places, refined like cruelty in a hot iron shop. 3 riders shifted to take the fence at angles that would box Tazba and Coulter and the children between horseflesh and rifle. Hoot's voice came thin from the slope behind Brighton. "Brighton." Brighton didn't turn. "You drowned," he said mildly. "I felt sorry about it." "You climbed out, I feel less sorry." Hoot swallowed. Rainwater had not washed the sound of mud from his throat. "It's bad land to make war on." "Then we'll civilize it," Brighton said, and set his spurs lightly. The horses moved. The mask of decision slid over Tazba's bones. When she was little, her father had taught her the 3 kinds of strong, the strong that lifts, the strong that endures, and the strong that bends and does not break. She had always carried all 3. Now the third one sang in her ribs. "Fence," she said to Coulter. "Fence," he agreed. Together they put their weight into the top rail and sprang. The wire popped loose with a cry like a hawk's anger. The corner staple screamed and spat free. The rail snapped up, whipping the air. Brighton's nearest horse lifted, terrified of the invisible snake that had just learned to fly. The rider lost a stirrup, his rifle skated sideways, a shot went into blue, surprised to be a cloud killer. Coulter moved with the brake. He grabbed the dancing top wire, looped it twice around a fence post's neck, and dropped his weight. The post levered, ugly and perfectly. It swung like a gate, and the horse on the wrong side found a world that had altered without permission. It tripped, went to its knees, and discovered humility. Its rider found sage with his face and then decided, for the first time in years, to reconsider whether he liked his job. Brighton didn't fall. Of course he didn't. Men like him have cores made of a different metal, something that resists accidents because accidents have learned the cost of misbehaving around them. He sat his horse through the lash of wire and the stumble of the animal next to him and the sudden off-key song of a world redirecting itself, and when he smiled again, it was calmer. Colder. Like he'd discovered that something worth his attention had woken up and sharpened its teeth. "All right," he said. "We'll buy the hard way." "Your money's no good here," Tazba said. "It smells like the inside of a boot." She stepped through the gap they'd made, towering in the shredded fence as if it had been built for this moment, and Brighton finally looked at her the way a man looks at a thunderhead that might decide it knows his name. The rifleman shot again, too fast, hands too angry, and the bullet laced a line through Tazba's sleeve without touching her skin. The fabric flapped open, a swallow's broken wing, and blood welled where one splinter had kissed her earlier, made wider by fear's rough fingers. She ignored it. Coulter did not. His eyes cut to red and back like a knife trying not to be one. "Put the gun down," he told the man, soft. "Make me," the man sneered, because he had not been introduced to wisdom yet. Something black moved out of the sky and became raven, sudden and obvious and ordinary as a miracle. It struck the rifle's barrel with its feet and screamed that rusted door hinge scream ravens reserved for men who have forgotten how to count. The shot went into dirt. The raven banged the air and came to sit on the torn post and looked very pleased with itself. Brighton's mouth ticked again. "Even your bird's like a sermon," he said to Tazba. "This will be interesting." He lifted his hand a third time, higher. "Take the gray," he repeated, and now his voice carried to the more patient men in the back who had not moved yet because they had been wondering if they would need to die today and had been hoping the answer was no. Ordway blew, a warning, not a panic. Coulter's fingers flexed on the broken post and then let go. He stepped forward, right hand open, left hand low. He did not look like a man about to fight, he looked like a man about to catch something valuable that had fallen from a shelf. "Think," he told Brighton's nearest hand, a kid with a patchy mustache and eyes that had not yet learned to lie. "You roped my horse, your boss will pay you with a nod and a promise. You refuse and step away, I will pay you with your life one day when you slip on ice and nobody else is close enough to grab your collar." The kid blinked, confused by the arithmetic. He lifted his loop anyway, and that decided the next 10 heartbeats. Tazba tossed her coil without reaching for it, the rope leapt into her hand like a tame snake remembering who taught it to stop when told. She threw past the kid, past Ordway, past the easy catch. Her loop dropped clean over Brighton's gloved hand and tightened on the wrist that had been giving the orders. She leaned as if a hillside needed a new shape and yanked him a groove closer to a lesson. Brighton's horse bunched, furious and confused. Brighton's body flowed over the saddle like oil over iron and found itself, of course, back in a seat that would make poets weep and priests swear. He looked at the rope on his wrist. He looked at her. He smiled, small. Then he lifted his rope hand, clever, and the loop skated off his glove and fell like a harmless idea. "Not my first dance," he said. "Then learn a new step," Tazba said, and moved again. The world narrowed to the circle of men and animals and wire. It became simple in the way only complicated things can be when lives gather and ask for math without decimals. Tazba's breath counted, 1 for Len at her calf, 2 for Naley at the herd, 3 for Grandmother Willow inside with cedar smoke in her shawl, 4 for Coulter's shoulder at her shoulder, 5 for the raven, which deserved a number because it had made a choice. Brighton's men had their numbers too. They chose wrong. They came like a rake dragged across dry grass, wide, hungry, promising to make order by tearing everything into strips. Coulter's hand found Tazba's without apology, just a brief grip, heat and bone, then gone, as he slipped through the first rider's reach and plucked the man from his stirrup by the belt as if the earth had a right to him. Tazba didn't punch. She turned shoulders into hips, weight into ground, and let a horse discover what a woman's center of gravity was made from. The animal veered away, unwilling to argue with a boulder that had decided to be female. Hoot, on the ridge, made a sound like a saw taking a knot and then did something nobody there had paid him to do. He slid down the slope and put himself between the kid with the mustache and the rope he'd almost thrown. "Don't," he said, "horse. You don't want that man teaching you what you are." "Which man?" the kid asked, honestly lost. "Either," Hoot said, and his voice broke on the word, because truth does that to men who haven't used it in a while. Brighton saw it all and did not hurry and did not look afraid. He guided his horse sideways until the fence and the gate and the Hogan door were all inside a geometry that felt, to Tazba's skin, like a shape he'd learned from a man in a suit with a pencil. He lifted his fingers again, two this time, a small careless victory, and one of his men leveled a carbine not at Coulter, not at Tazba, but at the dark inside of the Hogan door where Grandmother Willow's shawl had moved. "Don't," Tazba said, and this time the word tore itself in two on her tongue. "We're done playing," Brighton said. "You care." "I don't. Give me the gray and the man and the boy becomes interesting later instead of tragic now." Coulter turned his face toward Brighton and in that turn Tazba saw something he hadn't shown her yet, not fear and not sadness, but a grief he wore like a shirt under his shirt, the kind that had sweat rings and the smell of hard days. "Brighton," he said quietly. "Don't put your hand on that door." Brighton tilted his head. "You think you can stop me?" "I think," Coulter said, "you don't know what happens when this woman remembers she is older than your brand." "Show me," Brighton said, and the man with the carbine took the last half-inch of slack out of his cheek. Tazba moved. She did not know she had decided to. She was already moving. The body that had carried Len from the hole and Hoot from the flood made the choice for her mind and left the mind to narrate later. She stepped between the rifle and the door and accepted that if the world wanted a blood price, it would take it here and it would be cheap at the cost. The shot went off. It didn't hit her. The raven took it. Sound and feather and black astonishment blew wide. The bird caromed off the jam and into the Hogan, screaming a metal shriek that punched holes in every man's chest and filled them with a shape that didn't fit anymore. A single primary feather drifted down and landed on Tazba's shoulder like a black knife that had decided to become a quill. The carbine man stared at his hands as if they belonged to someone who had just struck a child. Then he vomited in the dust. Some men learn fast and some don't. That one learned. Brighton's smile finally cracked. Rage showed through like a coal bed under thin ash. "Enough," he snarled, and this time when he lifted his hand it wasn't to signal his men, it was to draw his pistol. A shot cracked from the Hogan's dark, neat and deep as a prayer whispered into an ear. Brighton's hat jumped. The bullet parted the crown and snatched a circle of felt into the air. Grandmother Willow's silhouette filled the doorway a second later, as simple and terrible as sunrise. The old woman held a flintlock that had belonged to her husband and his father before him. The smoke that rose from its mouth made a shape like a story told right. "You point a gun at my grandchildren," she said, voice thin and sharp as a bone needle, "and I stitch your arrogance to the sky where the crows will read it." Silence struck the world. It hit so hard the men forgot to breathe. Brighton breathed. He did it in through his nose and out through his mouth like a man who had been taught once to push pain away with rhythm. The pistol in his hand did not waver, but it did not rise again either. He looked at Grandmother Willow with something Tazba had not expected to see in him, not respect and not fear but recognition, the way a mountain recognizes a valley it did not expect to find. "Old woman," he said softly. "You talk like a creek knife. Listen like a thirsty man." Then, she snapped. "Leave this land. Leave these people. Your hunger is bigger than your skin, and you will burst like a frog in a harvest moon if you keep swallowing names." Brighton's eyes flicked to Coulter and back to Tazba. "You think you built a church with your fence and your bird in your grandmother's mouth," he said. "You built a fort. And forts fall. Maybe not today. Maybe not to me. But they fall." He holstered his pistol with a flourish that tried to hide the tremor in his thumb and failed. "We're done for the hour," he said, too mild. "Go inside. Count your children. Pet your sheep. When you sleep, dream of arithmetic. I'll bring you a problem you can't solve." He turned his horse and his men peeled off like scales from a snake's eye, silent, efficient, leaving behind the stink of money and the echo of a shot that had paid for a raven. Hoot stood where he'd stopped a child's sin and looked like a man who had misplaced his future somewhere he might or might not want to find it again. He met Tazba's eyes and didn't flinch. "I'll carry your words," he said, voice scraped clean. "I'll carry them even if they cut." "Good," she said. "Sharp things remember their work." The raven limped from the hogan, furious, alive. 2 feathers were missing and 1 wing drooped, but he came out swearing in raven and scolded everyone for their choices, including himself. Grandmother Willow stepped aside so the bird could have the threshold. Some beings need to win small arguments with doors to remember they're bigger than rooms. Coulter sank onto the fence rail, then stood again because the rail was broken and wouldn't hold him and because he did not sit when there was strength still to be spent. He looked at Tazba with a face that showed the inside of him without fear of being understood. "You were willing to die in front of the door," he said. "It wasn't a question." "I was willing to live there," she said. Then, softer, "and die if living first required it." He nodded once, like a man memorizing something long. "We have a small amount of time," he said. "He won't come in the next hour. He will come with more men and a smarter plan." "He'll come with paper," Grandmother Willow said, leaning her flintlock in the door jamb as if a weapon needed a place to lean to stay humble. "Men like that bring papers that make rivers forget their names." "Then we will teach the river to write ours," Tazba said. They did not waste the hour. They mended the fence with wire that had learned good manners by breaking and being taught again. They walked the herd higher on the slope, where moonlight later would make white backs into a spill of stars on earth. They burned wet cedar for blessing and dry cedar for warning scent. They cut 2 shallow trenches that would catch a fire that had confused itself and thought homes were brush. Coulter vanished for 10 minutes and returned with a coil of line thinner than her small finger and a canvas sack of iron stakes he admitted he had been saving for a day when the word enough would need to be drawn across a patch of world with something more than chalk. He did not explain where he had found them. He did not need to. Men who have wandered gather small tools against large hungers. Hoot left without being told. He took the path downwash, not toward the company camp but toward the scattering of clapboard shacks where riders spent wages and lost teeth. He walked like a man who had finally learned where his knees were designed to bend. Afternoon leaned into evening. The storm had carried away the worst of the heat, the sky went a cleaner blue than men deserve. Tazba and Coulter stepped the fence like a dance they had learned in a single song. Len shadowed them, solemn and shaking only where courage leaves space for truth. Naily tied cedar boughs to the gateposts in patterns Grandmother Willow murmured, old geometries sketched in green and sap. When the light went low enough to put gold into dust, riders appeared again at the far ridge. They did not come like a rake this time. They came like an invoice. For men in black coats despite the heat, hats stiff as courtroom chairs. Behind them, a wagon with a tarpaulin over something angular. Beside the wagon, 3 more riders from Brighton's string, faces the same shape as earlier, mouths more careful. A man with a satchel bounced over the ruts with his hand on the latch like a mother patting a fretful baby. In front, not on a horse but standing in a trap with polished wheels and a matched pair, sat a person whose posture turned air into rules. "Paper," Grandmother Willow said again, under her breath, and took a single step back into the hogan where the east-facing doorway could watch the sky for her while she taught the doorway a few last useful words. Brighton himself was not with the trap. He came 10 lengths behind it, alone, hat with a new crown and a new insult cut around its scar where a bullet had once rained. He looked younger with fury cleaned up and pressed. He had shaved. It made him prettier and more terrible, like a knife kissed by a whetstone. The trap stopped at the fence Tazba and Coulter had mended. The man who wasn't riding stepped down and dusted his cuffs and smiled with his mouth and not his teeth. "Good evening," he said. "I am Myron T. Stiles, duly appointed agent of Cobb Holdings, representing the interests of investors domiciled in Santa Fe, St. Louis, and elsewhere as may be required. I bring notice. Bring your name here without a title and I'll listen to the rest," Tazba said. The man glanced at Coulter as if asking for translation. Coulter didn't blink. "She told you how to be heard," he said. "It's a kindness. Take it." The smile sharpened. "Stiles," he said finally. "My mother called me Myron only when I deserved it." He held out an envelope as if it carried a mild fever that would do someone good. "This land is described within. The water is described within. This woman, yourself, the boy and the girl and the elder are described within. Your rights are extinguished therein. Your claims are remanded to civil court to be settled in due time. In the interim, we are commanded to protect the improvements and chattels for the benefit of the investors." "He thinks our lives are furniture," Naley whispered, and Tazba's hand found the back of her neck and made a small circle there that said *, "I know." "Me too, *. Coulter didn't reach for the paper. He looked at Brighton, who was not looking at the paper either. Brighton was looking at Tazba's hands. He always looked where the work lived. "Who signed your paper?" Tazba asked Stiles. "A judge," Stiles said, pleased. "Who signed your judge?" she asked. "Madam," Stiles said, gentle in the way of a man who puts a saddle on a horse that doesn't belong to him in front of the child who loves it, "the world is made of signatures. You will learn them or they will learn you." Tazba took the envelope. She did it to find out how the thing felt in her hand. It was heavier than she had expected. She turned it over once, then handed it to Grandmother Willow without looking back, as if her arm were longer than the years between them. The old woman's hand came out of the dark and took it like a snake taking a mouse, efficient and sad and necessary. Stiles nodded as if gravity had just performed to his satisfaction. He made a small gesture toward the wagon. The tarpaulin came off. Underneath waited a pump, new, iron, teeth to bite groundwater, hose coiled like a sunstruck snake. Men began to climb down with wrenches and the air went shiny with oil behavior. "Stop," Tazba said, and for the first time since noon, her voice cracked. Stiles blinked at the crack as if it was unprofessional of her. "No," he said politely. "We are within our rights." "You are within your greed," she said, and Brighton's eyes flickered, approving of the word because he liked things named. Coulter stepped forward so his boot and her boot made a line. "You are within range," he said to the men at the wagon, and the quiet in it was a length of rope stretched between two knots. Brighton swung down at last. He tied his reins to a post that had no right to hold him and did it with a flick that made the knot seem like a compliment. He took 2 steps and stopped with his boots inside the triangle made by Tazba's shoulder and Coulter's shoulder and the fence between them. "I told you I'd bring arithmetic," he said, voice almost kind. "Here it is. Do you know how to borrow?" Tazba did not answer him with numbers. "You can draw a river on paper," she said. "It will not wet your throat." Brighton's smile warmed a fraction. "It'll wet my crops," he said. "Which I put down with crews paid in cash that spends in town where men like hoot buy rooms and biscuits, and prayers, if they're cheap. That's a lot of throats." Hoot was nowhere visible, which meant he was somewhere important. Tazba filed the fact and kept her face still. Stiles sighed like a man whose soup had gone cold while children told stories. "Commence," he said to the crew by the wagon. They began. Coulter breathed in once and said a word Tazba didn't know. It didn't belong to her language or to his. It belonged to the world before the world put brands on itself. He moved. He reached the wagon in 3 easy steps and took the crank from a man's hand without knocking any knuckles. He turned and handed the crank to Brighton. "If you're stealing their water," he said calmly, "you turn the first turn. Or it doesn't count." Stiles bristled. He does not operate equipment, he said. We have men. Men, Coulter repeated softly, and the weight of the word bent the air like heat. Brighton met Coulter's eyes. The muscles at the corner of his jaw worked. If I touch your snake, he said, making the crank into a joke, does that make me a better thief? It makes you an honest one, Coulter said. Honest thieves are easier to fight. Brighton's laugh this time was true, if unkind. He took the crank. Tazba felt something tear in her, not fabric, not skin, but the thin film that separates sweat from rain. She did not step toward Brighton. She did not reach. She only watched his hand go to work on a machine that wanted to take by turning which men like this called work and others called permission. Brighton turned once. The pump grunted. He turned twice. Iron thought about water. He turned a third time. And something under the wagon coughed flame. There is a kind of quiet that is louder than the start of a gunfight. This was that. The cough was small, the flame smaller, the smell of lamp fuel, not much. But the pump ceased to be a pump in the minds of men. It became a promise to their lungs that air might not be a given for the next few breaths. Back, Stiles snapped, startled into a single syllable, and his men obeyed him because fear and politeness share bones. Coulter didn't move back. He moved forward and pulled the tarpaulin half over the cough and smothered it like a woman smothers a coal that has fallen from a hearth onto a woven mat. He protected their enemy's machine with the same hands that would have wrecked it, and Brighton saw him do it and lost, briefly, his hold on the script he had written for the hour. Why? Brighton asked. Not angry. Genuinely asking. Because I want to fight you, Coulter said. Not a fire. Some of the men whispered like grass. Stiles found his smiles again and pasted two to his cheeks for safety. Very well, he said too briskly. Mr. Cobb, if you will step aside we will recommence in. Not yet, Brighton said. Stiles blinked. Sir? Not yet, Brighton repeated, and his eyes were on Tazba's hands again, where a rope and splinter and raven feather and a little strip of her own skin made a new kind of tally. Leave it. We'll return with marshals. You have marshals, Stiles said. In my satchel. In triplicate. Those are letters, Brighton said without heat. Real marshals ride horses and arrive in bad moods because their wives told them not to come. He put the crank down and put his hand on the fence post as if to steady it so it wouldn't think too much. Tomorrow, he said to Tazba. At first light. I bring paper with legs. You bring all your strong words. We'll see which ones cast the longer shadow. Tomorrow, Tazba said, and her heart knocked once in approval because it wanted the night to work. They left. Stiles left first because men like him always have somewhere else to be precisely on time. The wagon grumbled over ruts, the crew held their wrenches as if they might need to cut bread with them rather than throats. Brighton was last. He paused at the broken section of fence, looked at it as if memorizing a diagram he meant to redraw, and touched the feather on the ground with his boot. He didn't hurt it. He just moved it 3 inches, which is a kind of hurt more men understand. Dark gathered. The wind shifted and forgot whose job it was. Grandmother Willow came to the threshold with a cup that smelled of cedar and steam and something bitter that unkinked the place between a person's shoulder blades. Tazba drank. Coulter did too, because he could not afford to be polite tonight, only useful. Sleep in the earth lodge, Grandmother Willow told the children. Where the old floor remembers men with good hearts and keeps them nearby. We will not burn lamps. We will burn breath. They settled the herd high and quiet. They walked the line again, twice, because men with paper often come first in feet after they have come in envelopes. The raven hunted beetles in the stubble with vindictive attention, every stab a small grammar lesson for fate. Hoot's absence stayed loud. Coulter set his thin line in the grasses beyond the broken fence where a man on a horse might not see it in starlight. He did it the way he had built everything around his life that still worked, patient, exact, ready to cut and then to mend. He looked at Tazba finally and let the horizon tilt between them. I don't know if I'm strong enough, he said simply. You already were, she said. Today. Twice. Tomorrow isn't today. It never is, she agreed. That is the mercy and the trouble. He hesitated. Then, if I stay, I put a target on your door. If I leave, I put a hole in your wall. Targets are flat, she said. Walls are thick. She put a hand on his chest, over the place where his shirt had worn down to threads from a saddle strap in honesty. Stay. His breath changed under her palm. Not faster. Truer. Yes, he said. They slept in pieces and woke in slices. Night rolled like a slow animal, breathing in cloud and out stars. When the gray that isn't light yet began to lift the edges of things, Tazba was already standing in the door, hair braided in one long rope, jaw set the way it goes when a person has decided to be a door rather than hide behind one. The first rider came quiet. Not Brighton. Not Styles. A silhouette that did not fit either man's shoulders. He stopped beyond the broken fence and lifted one hand. The thin line at his horse's knee glinted once, invisible again. Hoot, Coulter said softly beside her. He came back. Hoot rode up and did not look at the line because men who have nearly drowned remember other lines forever. He swung down and cupped his hands around his mouth. He's coming, Hoot said. Brighton. Marshal Kendrick and 2 deputies with him. Writs like saddle blankets. Men like fence posts. And, he swallowed, and fear and pride fought in his throat. And he has a woman with him in a bonnet. Tazba's stomach dropped as if the earth had played a mean joke with its geometry. Whose? Hoot shook his head. Not his. Somebody else's. The kind of bonnet a town puts on a widow when it wants her to wear shame to the store. Why bring her? Coulter asked. Hoot looked at the ground. To show what paper does to a person who stands between men and water. They're going to read her like scripture and make us listen. Grandmother Willow's hand found Tazba's shoulder. Stand, she said. And bend. Do both. That is how you keep a roof. They took their places as the sun thought about whether to rise today. The east went from steel to lead to pewter. Hoofbeats came like a line of punctuation walking into a courtroom. The herd lifted heads and then, wisely, lowered them again. Nayli stood behind the door's post where a shadow could keep her small. Len held the raven like a saucer of black tea, both hands solemn. Coulter set himself at Tazba's right, Ordway did the same. Brighton crested the ridge at the exact second the first ray of light cut the horizon with a blade. Of course he did. He had a talent for timing that would have made him a fine farmer if a judge had ever signed him to work for seed instead of for blood. To his left rode a man with a badge and a straight back and a mustache combed like a groom before his wedding. Behind them, 2 deputies with eyes that had spent time failing to sleep. To the right of the marshal sat a woman in a bonnet that hid her hair and most of the shape of her jaw. Her hands were folded on her lap like someone had told them to die quietly. They came to the fence. They stopped. Styles unfolded from the trap again like a mantis and cleared his throat with an official sound. Upon presentation of writ and seal, he began, "We are here to." The woman in the bonnet lifted her head. Tazba knew her before the face fully came into mourning. She knew the set of the mouth that had been asked to be small and had refused in ways only the intimate would understand. She knew the eyes that had looked too long at windmills and not enough at men. She knew the scar scored pale as chalk along the jaw's right edge where a wire had snapped and memory had decided to remain as a line. She knew the woman because she had seen that face once in a cattleman's camp, bent over a ledger and writing numbers that made sense until somebody else's idea of sense took the pencil away. Tamsin Cobb, Tazba whispered. Brighton smiled softly, like a man introducing a trick he had trained and loved for the wrong reasons. My sister, he said. Widow. Landless. Thirsty. She asks the court to place this water within reach of her children's mouths before greed drinks it first. Coulter's fingers closed on the fence rail so hard the wood complained. This is your arithmetic, he said. Make their hunger yours. Make her shame ours. Brighton tilted his head. Make paper into mercy, he corrected. Marshal Kendrick cleared his throat. His eyes were not cruel. They were tired. Ma'am, he said to Tazba, the court recognizes Ms. Tamsin Cobb's claim for emergency relief pending survey. The spring will be tapped to provide water for the destitute. Which destitute? Grandmother Willow asked from the door that faced east and therefore faced truth. The ones with ink? Or the ones with lung? Both, the marshal said, and the word hung between righteousness and foolishness the way words do when men try to be good inside a bad geometry. Brighton lifted his hat to Tazba in a parody of courtesy. Stand aside, he said. We'll draw half. You keep the other half. Everybody lives long enough for Styles to get paid twice. Tazba looked at Tamsin Cobb. The woman's eyes did not ask, they did not beg. They apologized for nothing but time. Children rode the lines in those eyes, children Brighton had used as weights on his arguments. Tazba drew breath. She was about to speak when Len made a small sound that meant now. Coulter's thin line sang. The deputy to the right lifted a boot to nudge his horse. The boot found the line. The horse surged, panicked at snake it couldn't see, lunged into the pump wagon's wheel. The wheel cracked a spoke. The wagon lurched. The pump slid. The tarpaulin, the one that had kept a cough from becoming a funeral, caught the wheel's broken tongue and wound itself in. Iron shrieked. The wagon tipped. Men shouted. The marshal's horse danced and did not throw him because it had learned to be a better man than its rider sometimes. Tamsin's trap rolled backward and kissed a rock and tried to climb it. Brighton's hand went to his pistol and then to the crank and then to the woman's elbow and then to the sky, because even his fingers couldn't decide which part of his world to hold first. The pump teetered. It began to fall. Straight toward Tamsin Cobb. Tazba moved without thought. So did Coulter. He went low, she went high. His shoulder took iron, her forearms took edge. Together they made a cradle from strangers and caught the thing that would have turned a woman into paper with bones. The world groaned around them. Iron tried to finish a sentence it had started in a different paragraph. Ordway took a step that made space where there was none and did not step on the raven because saints remember their own sermons. The pump hung for a breath between gravity and covenant. Brighton's hand closed on Tazba's bicep. He wasn't pulling her away. He was adding his weight to the cradle. He didn't look at her. He looked at his sister. Hold, he said through his teeth. Hold, Tazba said back. They held. Men found levers. Men found boards. Men found the sense God issues with the first slap of air into lungs and forgot when money started to count faster than breaths. The pump settled upright again, askew but not murderous. The wagon exhaled. The trap stopped climbing the rock. Tamsin Cobb's hands trembled once and then remembered how to remember. The marshal swore, once, quietly. Everybody be still, he said in a tone that turned mourning into a commandment. He dismounted with the carefulness of a man stepping down from an argument on which he had wagered his own sleep. He walked to the fence. He put his palm on the post the way Brighton had done the night before and then took it away, as if he'd touched something too honest for his job. Miss Nez, he said to Tazba. I don't know how to be right today. Then be kind, she said. Kindness works when right breaks. He nodded like a student who had forgotten his chalk and found a nail. Mr. Cobb, he said, turning. You will not pump this spring today. Styles made a scandalized sound. Marshal. Be quiet, Kendrick said without looking at him, and for a heartbeat Tazba liked the man very much. Tomorrow, the marshal went on, we will convene here with the county surveyor, the preacher, and whomever this woman, he tipped his chin at Grandmother Willow, names as the land's memory. Me, Grandmother Willow said. And the raven. Amen, Kendrick said gravely, and some of the men laughed not at all and not because they were polite. Styles sputtered about writs and ex partes and residential something that was not a lamb. Brighton said nothing. He was looking at his sister with a face that had finally discovered a crack he could not polish out. Tamsin kept her eyes on Tazba. "Thank you," Tamsin said simply. "For what?" Tazba asked. "For holding me in front of my brother," Tamsin said. "He doesn't know how to hold me without turning me into an argument." Brighton flinched as if the word had drawn blood where he had forgotten he had skin. The marshal led his horse 3 steps back and looked hard at the pump as if he meant to arrest it. "We're done," he said. "Go home." But home does not return when a man says so, it arrives when a choice is made. As men began to turn their horses and Styles began to snatch at his papers as if they would sprout legs and run into the sage, a single shot cracked from the low cut beyond the bench, the place where the wash had taken Len and given him back. It wasn't a warning shot. A deputy fell forward over his horse's neck like a man who had remembered to pray and forgotten to stop riding. His hat rolled to the fence and stopped against Tazba's boot with a small conversational thump. Every head turned toward the cut. Smoke curled there like a question mark. A second shot. The marshal's badge rang like a coin on an anvil as the bullet struck it and tore the pin loose and made the law duck without pride. "Down!" Coulter shouted, and the decent men obeyed and the indecent ones bared their teeth and looked for cover by instinct and not by conscience. Brighton's face changed. Not to fear. To recognition and then to rage, the clean kind that knows exactly where to go and finds it without a map. "Who?" Tazba asked, low. Brighton didn't take his eyes off the cut. "Men I didn't hire," he said. "Men my money hires anyway when it wanders out of my pocket. They'll kill the marshal so the paper grows teeth and then they'll kill you so it learns to chew." The raven screamed a word no man had a right to translate. Coulter lunged for the fallen deputy's rifle and threw it to Tazba without thinking, because a covenant is nothing if it doesn't assume who should hold what at the right time. "Len," Tazba said, breath steady, eyes steady, heart a fist she could open or close at will, "inside." "I won't." "Inside," she repeated, and he listened because he had learned the difference between defiance and strength. Naley was already moving. Children who decide to be walls never need telling twice. Grandmother Willow lifted the flintlock again and murmured something to it about being old and being enough. "Brighton," Coulter said. "With me." Brighton looked at him for one heartbeat and then nodded. "With you." They moved toward the cut at a run, 2 men who had taught Payne their last names, a woman behind them who had taught Payne arithmetic, a marshal beside them who had remembered he was slower than he used to be and did not lie to the truth. The thin line Coulter had set earlier lay slack in the grass now, no good to them where they were going. The third shot came and chewed a new notch in the fence post at Tazba's left shoulder, a lover's mark from a bullet too stupid to love. "Stay low," Coulter said. "I'm large," Tazba said. "Low is a rumor." "Then be stone," he said. "I already am," she said, and put her body between the cut and the door again because some truths cannot be learned twice, they only grow wider when you share them. Smoke thickened at the lip of the wash. The shape within it was a man, or 2 men, or a plan that had finally stepped out of the brush and found it had knees and liked how they bent. Someone laughed, a high, thin sound like a wire snapping and cold. "Taz," Coulter said, and then he went silent, because the shape moved into light and became a face he knew. And Tazba watched the tendons in Coulter's forearm go rope hard as the name left his mouth in a single syllable that tasted like blood and history. "Reese." The man in the smoke lifted his rifle and smiled wide and slow, as if he were tasting the morning on his tongue and had found it sweet with grief. Coulter's past had come to finish what paper had started. The rifle breathed. And the shot raced toward the doorway where Tazba stood, toward the place where Covenant and Courage had built a home still drying from yesterday's storm. And the world, which had just begun to give them a different kind of math, shattered into pieces that would not fit together again the same way. Falling into pieces that would not fit together again the same way. The bullet cut the breath from the morning. It came skimming between fence posts, licking splinters from a rail, burning its own short tunnel through the cool. Tazba did not watch its mouth, she watched its shadow. A bullet carries one if the light is right. A flicker passed along the Hogan wall, thin as the leg of a locust, and her body moved with the fact before her mind gave it a name. She leaned left, the doorpost kissing her shoulder hard enough to bruise later, and threw her right arm out like a gate closing on a frightened ewe. Len's ribs slid under her forearm. She dragged him the half-step that separates harm from lesson. The bullet touched air where a boy had been and hit the fire-stained lintel instead. The old wood took the strike and answered with a cough of black dust and one charred chip. Inside, she breathed, and felt him obey, felt Naley's small, iron-shaped turn and shepherd him in with a stare that bent panic into obedience. Grandmother Willow's hand reached from the dim and took both children's wrists and made them part of the house in a way no paper could unmake. Coulter was already moving. He slid behind the broken section of fence and went low, low as a man can go and still remember he has lungs. His eyes had locked on the cut where smoke curled into a question mark. "Reese," he said again, quieter, as if the name had a taste he had hoped never to taste twice. Brighton Cobb had not drawn. He had his hand on the fence post like yesterday, and his thumb was tapping once, twice, the metronome of a man who could turn impatience into precision. He did not look at Coulter when he said, "How many?" "2. Maybe 3, Coulter answered. Ruthless enough to pretend the law is a quiet dog. Marshal Kendrick had his badge back on its pin by a miracle or by a stubbornness that shamed the pin. He flattened behind the wagon's wheel, lifted his head like a prairie dog, and then pushed his hat back on his skull as if that would improve the angle of the world. "Deputies," he barked, and then hissed when he remembered one was on the ground with his hat against Tazba's boot. "Stand down until you see what you're shooting at." Another shot. It struck the pump's iron throat and sang, and the song went through Coulter's bones into the earth and up through Tazba's boots and into the doorframe where Grandmother Willow stood. The old woman did not flinch. She had listened to bigger songs in smaller rooms and never misplaced a child on account of them. A shape moved at the lip of the cut, too quick, too pleased. Tazba saw an elbow, a cheekbone, a hat brim with a grease stain like a crescent moon. She did not fire the fallen deputy's rifle, she did not even bring it to shoulder. She lifted it by the strap, hooked it over a broken fence picket so the barrel pointed at sky, and said to Coulter without taking her eyes off the cut, "Speak." "Reese Mathers," Coulter said, which was more than a name. It was a set of directions to an old wound. "We rode once." He liked to call his own shots after he took them. He believes God can be stapled to a ledger. "Paper again," Tazba murmured. "Paper with gunpowder in the margins," Coulter replied. Brighton shifted. It was small, an inch of boot, a half-breath. It put him fractionally in front of Tamsin, who sat rigid in the trap with her bonnet shadowing a face that refused to be hidden. Brighton did not appear to notice he had moved. Tamsin noticed and did not shame the noticing with speech. "Reese!" Kendrick shouted. "This is a court day. Put your gun down and put your mouth up where the law can hear it." Reese laughed. It came out thin and high, the sound a wire makes when a cold morning reminds it to fail. "Marshal," he sang back. "I never talk to furniture." Another shot. It chewed bark off the cottonwood by the spring and the tree threw its green up like a startled horse. The raven launched itself from the fence and went black across the light like a word struck out by a stern teacher. It dove once toward the cut, a dramatic, foolish, holy gesture, and then flared away again when a second rifle belched sand at its belly. It came back swearing and landed on the pump's crank, daring the morning to misinterpret it. "Coulter," Brighton said softly. "You still owe me a horse. You pay me with Reese's hands, I'll forgive the rest." Coulter's mouth made a smile that had no joy in it and a great deal of truth. "You're going to like the man I am today, Cobb," he said. "He pays debts in better coin." "Get him out of my wash," Grandmother Willow said dry as cedar. "Reese, and the fear he rides." "Yaddy," Tazba breathed to the land because greeting must come even when the guest is a problem. She stepped out from the doorway to where the fence had broken and stood in the tear like a seamstress deciding whether to mend with thread or with leather. "Stay in cover," Kendrick snapped instinctively, and then swallowed it because he'd already seen enough to know that telling this woman how to be weather would only get a man wet in the wrong way. The cut lay 30 paces off. The wash's walls were gold and pink and gray, a geology lecture interrupted by an angry child. Smoke drifted out like a sly idea. Reese moved again, an inch, then 2, the barrel of his rifle long and smug. Coulter lowered himself into the sage until his hat brushed seed heads. "On your pole," he said to Tazba. She nodded, and something quiet and immense passed between them, like the river showing bedrock to a fish. She lifted both hands, palms out, fingers spread the way a weaver spreads warp before passing the weft. Then she spoke to the wash in a voice that sounded like stone being refreshed by rain. "You hold men sometimes," she told it. "Hold this one. Hold him until he remembers his grandmother." She took the 3 steps that moved her from fence to open, shoulders a mountain, throat steady. She did not run. Running teaches bullets bad habits. She walked as if the wind lifted her knees on its schedule and not hers. Reese fired. The shot went wide, a clean miss born not of mercy but of surprise. He had never killed a mountain before, and his hands did not yet know how. "Now," she said, and Coulter moved. He did not run either. He flowed. He left the fence and became sage and then shadow and then the shape of a man who had learned from sheep how to disappear in a world that pretends there is no such arithmetic. He slid under the lip of the cut and found purchase in a notch where Flood had once argued with Sandstone and lost politely. Brighton's hand came up at the same moment, 2 fingers lifted to draw his riders to a flanking angle that was more loyalty than strategy. Kendrick muttered something that was 3/4 prayer and 1/4 inventory. Tamson's hands folded harder until the knuckles went white and then looser as if remembering bones do not obey men merely because men have signatures. Another shot from Reese. It struck the edge of the door frame and cracked a splinter that would be a good kindling later if anyone remembered to save it. "Now." Coulter came up over the lip like a wolf deciding he'd one more job to do before he let the night have him. Reese whirled with the joy of recognition, turning his eyes glassy. "There he is," he shouted, and the love in it was so wrong it made the air taste of tin. Coulter never reached for his pistol. He went empty-handed toward a man with a rifle and did not look brave because brave is a show and he was doing a job. He put his left forearm across Reese's barrel and shoved it toward the sky at the same time his right hand found the back of Reese's collar and reminded it what leverage meant. The rifle went off like a bad idea escaping a good plan. The bullet killed nothing but weather. Reese twisted like a cat in a sack and tried to bite Coulter's thumb. Coulter drove his knee into Reese's thigh, hard enough to make muscles reconsider their loyalties, and pressed the muzzle into sand. A second figure stood in the smoke, smaller, stooped, the partner. Tazba saw him only as a change in color, a deeper gray moving where a lighter one had been. She lifted her chin and gave him her eyes, the ones her father had said could make coyotes tell the truth. He lifted his pistol, her gaze did not waver. "Go home," she said. "Your mother is thirsty." The pistol trembled. Lowered. Shot anyway, into the dirt at his own boot, as if some part of him had decided to hit the only target he could punish without making the world more crooked. He turned and ran from the idea of himself. Reese snarled. "Always thought you'd die in front of a woman," he grated to Coulter, the words wet with spit and bravado. Coulter did not answer with speech. He used the only sentence Reese had always understood. He took Reese's balance and removed it, quick and neat, and put the man belly down in the grit with his right arm pinned in a way that would let him keep it if he learned now and would cost him pieces of it if he didn't. "Marshal," Coulter called. "Arrest paper with a pulse." Kendrick came at a crouch, cursing under his breath with a creativity that would have earned him extra chores in church. He slapped irons on Reese's wrist, then the other, then sat back on his heels and let his hat tip forward to hide the quick, unbelieving grin of a man who had been given a day he had not earned but would try to deserve anyway. Silence fell in 2 pieces. The first was relief, the second was the quiet that follows a hammer blow and waits to discover whether the board split along the grain or across it. Brighton exhaled like he'd been thinking about forgetting how. He took his hand off the fence post and stood straight and found that the world had not gotten taller while he was bent. His eyes went to Tazba. "You move like a river with an opinion," he said, and Tamsin's mouth quirked, like she had heard that sentence before in another form and had kept it because she liked how it fit. Reese laughed again, face in the sand, shoulders shaking. "You think you won," he said into the grit. "That wasn't the game." "The game," Kendrick said dryly, "is you in my jail and me writing a telegram that says send better men to the next argument." "No," Reese said, and he sounded genuinely delighted now, which is always the worst sound a cruel man makes. "The game is who signs your telegram. The game is what it buys while it rides. The game is how fast paper grows legs when you turn your back to fix a fence." Styles found his voice again, slick with indignation. "Marshall, we've had enough of this circus. Place that man under, and then step aside so the crew can commence lawful." "Styles," Brighton said without turning his head. "Shut up." The agent's mouth snapped shut with a click like a beetle being corrected by a bird. He swallowed anger like a gambler swallows a bad card when a sheriff walks past. Kendrick hauled Reese to his feet. The man's grin did not leave his face. It was all teeth and childhood, the kind that never got the right lessons in the right order. "You'll need more paper," Reese told Brighton, cheerful. "Yours can't carry the weight of her." He jerked his chin at Tazba. "Mine never tried," Brighton said, and the truth of it surprised him and everyone else. He looked at Tazba, and his eyes were not soft, but they were less foolish than yesterday. "It will have to learn." Tamsin's hands unclasped. She raised her head fully, bonnet falling back an inch, and Tazba saw the line along her jaw, a story in chalk. "Brighton," Tamsin said, and the brother flinched because when a sister says your name in front of the law on a woman like this one, you are about to meet a door you cannot open with money. Stop picking fights your paper cannot carry home. Ask for water the way people with thirst ask, with honesty, and with your hat off." Brighton looked like a man who had not known he was thirsty until someone said the word aloud. His hat came off without his permission. He turned to Tazba. "Water for the destitute," he said, quoting the marshal's clumsy kindness because it was safer than making up his own for now. "We start there." Tazba shook her head. "We start with names," she said. "Destitute is a pile. Names are people." She lifted her chin at Styles. "Bring your book." Styles took a half step forward and then froze when the raven hopped once and set its beak politely on the leather of his satchel as if to say, "Be careful with your mouth." He opened the bag and pulled out a ledger too clean for this country. He uncorked a pen that looked more valuable than some men's lives. "No," Tazba said. "Not yours. His." She pointed at the marshal. Kendrick blinked, then reached into his coat and produced a smaller book whose leather had known rain and hands and bad coffee. He offered it to her without asking what he was giving away. She cradled it the way she would a lamb born in a wind. She licked the tip of the marshal's pencil, a tiny sacrilege and a holiness at once, and wrote across the first clean page in letters that would not apologize later, the water agreement of Siphon Gulch, witnessed by sun and stone. "Now," she said. "Tamsin Cobb." Tamsin hesitated the length of a heartbeat. Then she stepped down from the trap and came to the fence as if she were meeting an elder in a doorway. She took the pencil. Her handwriting was neat and stubborn. She wrote her name and then beneath it the names of her children as if to tell the paper who would drink. "Marshall Kendrick," Tazba said. He signed without squinting. "Brighton Cobb," she said, and held his eyes while he weighed whether the ink would steal something from him that he could not buy back. He signed. The letters came out beautiful and arrogant, then halted, then finished plain. A man learning in the space between a capital and a period. "Grandmother Willow," Tazba said. Grandmother Willow reached to the page from the door. Her hand shook, but the line of her letters did not. She signed in dine. Then, beside that, she drew the sign her own grandmother had used when soldiers took names and left numbers, a small, careful spiral like a spring scene from the sky. "Coulter Ash," Tazba said. Coulter hesitated. He looked at Reese, iron now, eyes bright, a smile that had placed a chair at its own table, and then back at the pencil. "This time," Coulter said softly, "we sign a thing that makes us heavier instead of lighter." He put his name down. It looked like a fence line that had learned how to be straight without turning cruel. And me, Tazba said last, because a house must be named after its doors are measured. She wrote Tazbanaz and underlined both names because both mattered. Then she turned the book and held it out to the raven. The bird cocked its head, considered, and stabbed once at the top right corner. Ink smeared into a print that looked like a star that had decided to be a foot. The men laughed, not at the bird, but near the idea of joy. Witnessed, Tazba said. Kendrick cleared his throat. We'll still have the survey, he said, but he said it like a man telling a story the children already know and like anyway. But this is a start a court can understand because it understands names better than it understands thirst. Stiles opened his mouth to protest. Brighton touched his elbow with a look that said you may keep your job if you don't spend all your words at once. Stiles closed his mouth and rearranged his dignity. Marshal, Coulter said. Get Reese to town before he finds a way to wag the dog with his tail. Gladly, Kendrick said, and then hesitated, a bad habit of good men near the end of a hard hour. Miss Nez. Tazba knew what he was asking. Will you be all right when Paper learns to walk again? She nodded once. We will be here, she said. That's our weapon. Kendrick grunted what might have been respect and might have been thanks and led Reese toward the ridge. The deputies gathered reins and glances and neither dropped either. Tamsin stood with her hands open as if she had just been handed air and found it enough. Brighton lingered. Tomorrow, he said quietly. We start a trough and a schedule. Halves. Thirds, Tazba said. One for our people, one for yours, one for the land that held us both while we were busy making decisions that didn't include it. He looked at her for a long moment, something catching in his chest. Then he nodded. Thirds, he said. I can respect a shareholder I can't buy. He tipped his hat to Grandmother Willow with a sincerity that made his neck look young for the first time and rode after the law. The ranch fell into a different kind of quiet, one that sounds like work waiting to be done and not like fear waiting to be named. The children came out of the hogan. Len went straight to the broken place in the fence and squatted there, touching wire with a tenderness he usually saved for injured birds. Nayli fetched a gourd and offered it to the raven first, because she had watched the morning and learned fresh rules. Coulter leaned on a post that had seen 2 gunfights and 3 prayers in as many days. He took off his hat and ran a hand through hair that had been brave for longer than it should. You gave the law a spine, he said to Tazba. I gave it names, she said. Spines come after. He was quiet for a time. Ordway snuffled at his sleeve and then at the spiral Grandmother Willow had drawn, then stood as if he had decided the spiral belonged to him and he would defend it as he defended Coulter's shadow. When he spoke again, Coulter's voice had the gentleness of a man who had learned that gentleness multiplies when used. Reese will try again, he said. He's a thirst that drinks other thirsts. He will try, Tazba agreed. He will fail if he meets us all at once instead of one at a time. She looked at Len, at Nayli, at Grandmother Willow, at the raven, at the mended line, at the horizon where dust lifted and fell in honest labor. We are many, she said. Even when we are only 5. Afternoon put gold on everything that would hold still long enough to take it. They mended what could be mended and blessed what couldn't. Hoot returned at last, shoulders lower, eyes clearer, carrying a sack of nails and a bottle of apology he did not unscrew because some things must remain bottled to be useful. I told them, he said simply. I told the boys who like to swing guns that the ground here bites harder than it looks, and the women bite harder than that. Some laughed. Some packed. Packing is a kind of prayer, Grandmother Willow said, and Hoot looked at his hands and decided not to argue with a person who kept the door facing east because she liked to watch the sun catch men in their lies. They set a trough below the spring, not a big one and not a greedy one. Coulter dragged the iron stakes, and Tazba set them with a sledge that had belonged to her father and that remembered his hands when hers tired. The children gathered stones for a small channel so the trickle into the trough would not make a wound in the ground. The raven supervised from the fence post and occasionally stole a pebble larger than itself out of sheer belief. By sundown, water ran where it should and not where paper said it might. A small line of neighbors from farther down the bench had formed without anyone calling them, people arriving with clean buckets and cleaner intentions. Tazba signed their names in the marshal's book as they came. Old Mrs. Begay, who had once stitched a sky across a child's cradleboard and now asked for 2 bucketfuls for her tomatoes. Manolito and his son, who ran goats in debt in equal measure. The widow of a man who had won a horse race and lost a liver. 2 cowhands whose mouths had learned to be humble since sunup. Thirds, Tazba told each. Thirds today, thirds tomorrow. If drought teaches, we will learn different math. Drought always teaches, Mrs. Begay sniffed. Question is whether the students show up. She tilted her chin at Coulter. You show up? I do now, he said, and he did not need to say I didn't before because men who admit the second earn the first. They ate when the sky went violet. Grandmother Willow made fry bread that puffed like hope. Tamsin Cobb returned, not with a trap this time, but with a covered basket and 3 children whose faces looked like hers and like Brighton's and like themselves. The smallest clutched a wooden spoon like a weapon and looked suspiciously at Ordway until the horse lowered his head and exhaled and allowed the spoon to tap his nose. The child's suspicion turned into a religion on the spot. Tamsin and Tazba stood a yard apart for a heartbeat too long, and then they closed it and hugged as if they had been waiting since childhood. Thank you, Tamsin said again into Tazba's shoulder. You held more than a pump, Tazba answered into Tamsin's hair. You held a man's past without letting it become his future. In the middle of the night, when coyotes stitched a coarse laugh across the hills and the moon made a milk line along the fence, Coulter woke from a dream of water and paper fighting in a dry riverbed and found Tazba sitting with her back against the doorpost, awake. Can't sleep? He asked softly. Can't stop listening, she said. I always listen after a day that changes the math. What do you hear? The ground, she said, smiling without humor. It's writing a letter to itself about how we behaved. She tilted her head. It says the men with paper will be back strong. It says Brighton learned but Styles grew teeth. It says the marshal will stand but his knees will shake. It says Reese will look for a place to put a hole in tonight. Where? Coulter asked. She pointed without pointing. Where men are alone. He breathed in and out once, slow. I've been alone, he said. Not anymore, she said, and she did not blush because truth these days did not require ceremony to stand. Dawn came clean. The surveyor followed it, a small man with a big instrument and a bigger desire to be taken seriously. He planted his tripod in his curves and his complicated assurances and measured a world that did not mind being measured so long as the measuring did not turn to chopping. The preacher came too, hat in hand, eyes kind. He had the sense to bless water without claiming it for his church, which is a trick some men never learn. Marshal Kendrick returned hollow-eyed but steady, a folded telegraph in his pocket. He pulled it out finally and handed it to Tazba. From the judge, he said. Says hold. Says listen to the people who live there. Says don't be a fool. Good judge, Grandmother Willow said. We should invite him to dinner if he keeps it up. Styles arrived dressed like a deed. He carried 3 more folders and an expression you could slice bread with. Brighton rode beside him looking like a man who had stayed up too late remembering things and had made friends with the result. Tamsin walked, children in tow, because walking sometimes tells the land a person wants to hear what it says between hoofbeats. They met at the fence where everything met now. Styles cleared his throat and began, in consideration of. Names first, Tazba said for the second day in a row, and the preacher smiled into his sleeve. The surveyor measured. The marshal listened. The preacher witnessed. The raven hopped indignantly at Styles's boots when the man stepped without looking, and Styles apologized to a bird because he wanted this to end and because apologizing to the wrong witness had a way of making the right ones easier later. At noon, Brighton surprised everyone, perhaps especially himself. He took his hat off without fanfare and said, "Thirds it is. My riders will pump and haul up to the line. Her people will take from the line. My sister will oversee the tally, because she counts with a sharper pencil than any of you. He looked at Styles. If you have a problem with that sentence, fire yourself. Styles opened his mouth and then, after a long public conversation with pride, shut it again. Excellent, he said eventually, as if the word had required dressing for the weather. I will draft accordingly. Draft what already breathes, Tazba said. Don't give it diseases. They signed again. The surveyor added a map with lines that could hold numbers without being cages. The preacher added a line in his slow, careful hand that said, as witnessed by the living, October sun, and Raven. The marshal put his badge over the page while it dried so the wind would have to work for any theft it entertained. In the afternoon, trouble tried anyway. It came not from the ridge or the cut but from the far end of the bench where a draw had been bitten deeper by 100 small rains. A dust plume rose, small and purposeful. A single rider. Reese. Kendrick swore. How? Paper walked, Tazba said grimly. It unlocked his cuffs and opened his cell, and the deputy decided to be a father instead of a jailer for 10 minutes too long. Reese came at a lope, smiling like a man who had been invited to a party he intended to ruin and whose invitation was printed on somebody else's grief. He did not slow. He did not shout. He let his rifle say hello. The bullet screamed past the trough and clipped a tin dipper. The dipper jumped like a startled frog and landed in the dust, ringing. Children! Tazba barked. Len and Nayli obeyed without skidding. They were already moving. They had slept with their boots near their beds and wisdom in their hands all night. Brighton drew this time. He did it without flourish. The pistol in his hand looked less like a lie and more like a tool. He did not fire. Not yet. He waited for Reese to choose an angle that would put a cowhand's horse between him and the doorway, and then he put the bullet where it would do only arithmetic on Reese's options without doing subtraction to a living thing. Reese dodged. He was fast and dirty and had been blessed with the kind of luck that keeps a cruel man alive long enough to make him worse. He turned his horse into the draw, intending to skirt the fence and pay the trough a bloody compliment from the side. Line, Coulter said, and Tazba smiled with her teeth. He meant the thin line he had set last night. It lay sleeping in the grasses beyond the broken fence where the world narrows to a point before it opens toward the draw. Reese didn't see it. Reese never saw anything lower than his own appetite. His horse did. Horses always do. The animal took the line across the cannon bones and went from flying to kneeling in a single blasphemous miracle. Reese went over the neck and discovered gravity in the old way, face first, hands slow, pride late. Coulter was already on him. He did not hit him. He did not need to. He put his boot on Reese's wrist and bent until bone explained policy to tendon. Reese howled. The rifle clattered to sage. The raven descended from a precise not great height and pecked the back of Reese's head exactly once as if signing a receipt. Kendrick arrived blowing like a bellows and slung irons on Reese in a way that suggested he did not intend to misplace them again. Town, he said to a deputy who had sprinted to catch up and looked ready to vomit. Now. No stops. No cousins. No pity. Yes, Marshal, the deputy croaked, and went. Reese lifted his head once as his cheek met the dust again and glared at Tazba the way a boy glares at the person who took the last cookie when he had planned to steal them all. Strong, he said, as if the word were an insult. Strong, she agreed, and let him see that the word in her mouth had a roof on it. He spat, and it landed nowhere anyone intended to stand. After that, the day stayed obedient. Men did what they said they would. The trough filled. The line at it became a conversation instead of a quarrel. Styles sat with his satchel and wrote, and each page he filled made him a little more human, as if the act of recording choices he had not authored was teaching his hand to belong to his arm. At dusk, Kendrick rode back alone from the ridge where the deputies had carried Reese. He looked exhausted and lighter. On a train, he said simply. With a chain. East. Not our problem until a judge makes it mine again. Judges are men. Men are problems, Grandmother Willow observed, and Kendrick laughed despite himself, then coughed to make it seem he hadn't. Night fell. Stars arrived on schedule, old, punctual ants who bring pies you didn't ask for. The wind smoothed the day's edges. A coyote sang out of simple professional pride and was answered by another who had the better voice and less shame. Tazba stood with Coulter at the fence and watched the dark be kind to their scarred place. "You were wrong once," she said out of nowhere. "Which time?" he asked. "My mornings are a bouquet of wrong. When you said no man is strong enough for me," she said. "You were right. And then you were wrong." He turned his head. The quiet between them shifted shape. "We," he said, letting the words sit in the air like a small animal deciding whether to trust a hand. "We might be." "We," she agreed, and she did not look away when she said it because she had no interest in letting the night play interpreter. The week that followed did not become a hymn. It was work. Work with splinters and arguments and aching backs and the kind of small tragedies that come when you decide to kidnap each other's lambs and men decide to be helpful in the shape of stubbornness. But the trough filled and emptied and filled again, and names were written and held, and children drank, and the raven stole 2 buttons in a sermon and returned none of them. Styles found a better chair for himself, one that fit the shade and didn't pretend to be a throne. He began greeting Grandmother Willow with the respect a man gives a door that has been opening for more years than his job has existed. The preacher learned not to put his hand on the ledger unless asked. The surveyor finished his map and left it, rolled and tied and accurate, on Tazba's table. "For your wall," he said, and she smiled and set it in the east-facing corner so the first light would read it each day. Brighton changed in ways so small a lesser witness would have missed them. He began to ride alone at odd hours. He started saying please to the trough and thank you to the fence, and he did not say either like a man doing penance but like a man practicing words he had discovered he liked in his mouth. When Styles proposed a new clause that would have given the company first draw on the 3rd share during drought, Brighton said, "No," and the no did not bruise. It simply stood. Tamsin began coming every morning, bonnet abandoned in favor of a ribbon that held her hair back with a minimum of apology. She carried 2 ledgers, the marshal's and her own, and learned the cadence of names until the names began to sing back at her. She and Tazba learned each other's silences and left them intact when they were good and opened them when they were not. Hoot went to work for Tamsin, which meant he went to work for himself for the first time in his life. He fetched and carried and lifted and did not reach for a bottle even when the creak behind the bunkhouse memorized his name. He came one evening with a rowel for Coulter's bare spur and held it out without looking at his shoes. "Finish what you start," he said gruffly. Coulter took it and did. One late afternoon, a cloud bank climbed the far horizon and stood there, undecided, like a guest at the edge of a dance floor. The air went young. The sheep muttered hope. Tazba felt something old and tight inside her chest loosen on a hinge. "Rain," she said, and the word tasted as sweet as anything she had spoken since she was a child. It came at dusk, straight down, clean, as if the sky had remembered it owed an apology and meant to make it public. Ordway turned his face into it and closed his eyes like a monk. The raven shouted at it for show and then drank. The trough overflowed and nobody cried theft. The land smelt of iron and triumph. The Hogan's roof ticked. A creek woke and tried to remember its way between 2 stones it had once loved and had not seen in 6 months. The children ran and got wet and learned that mud is a teacher who asks a lot and gives all of it back in laughter. Thunder stepped closer. Not the mean kind. The kind that reminds a place that the drumbeat is a heart and the heart is worth keeping time to. Tazba stood in it until the braid down her back clung like a river, and Coulter stood with her until the dust left them and the lines around his eyes were just lines and not maps. When the rain stopped, it left the world newer and older at once. Wet cedar smoke rose straight and then braided into the night. Coyotes forgot their quarrels and sang harmonies so sweet it hurt. They might have slept like the righteous if not for the messenger who came at midnight, hard riding, hard breathing, saddle squeaking a confession. He slid off his horse in front of the fence and bent double to cough the way men cough when a message has tried to turn into a lung problem on the way. "Tazba Nez," he rasped. "Marshall sent me." Judge's writ. Big one. Men coming. With a cart and a bigger paper and a promise to move the trough uphill and the fence south and the door west if the ink says so. Tonight, she asked, dry now, hair wrung and coiled and ready. The rider shook his head violently enough to dislodge regret. Morning. Sunday. They like light when they steal. Thank you, she said. Food's in the house. Bed is where the floor meets your back. Sleep. He went in and collapsed where Grandmother Willow pointed. The old woman tucked a shawl around him as if he were a child who had finally delivered his first fine sentence and deserved reward. Tazba stood outside with Coulter and watched the stars argue about whether to keep their places. We will not run, she said. We will not, he agreed. Brighton will come, she said. He will, Coulter said. He has learned to stand even when he wants to buy a chair. And if he does not, she asked, because naming fear robs it of its costume. Then we stand with Tamsin, he said. And the Marshal. And the Raven. And Hoot. And the preacher if he remembers his job. She nodded. She put her hand in his for one heartbeat and let it go, because promises begin small in countries that have been heard big. Dawn found them in the doorway with their boots on. The east flamed. The herd breathed low. The trough shone like a silver strip of story. They came on time, Stiles with a new satchel and an old smirk, a deputy from the county seat with a mustache that curled like punctuation, two men in vests too tight who smelled of ink and ambition, the surveyor looking apologetic for arriving with the wrong crowd and trying to pretend they were merely cousins. Brighton rode with them, jaw set, hat down over eyes that had decided to look with the same shape no matter what they saw. Tamsin walked, face bare to the light, children at her heels. The writ was long. The deputy began to read. He liked a good paragraph the way some men like a hard drink. He delivered whereas and heretofore and proprietary like a man making a pie his mother would be proud to see cut. Stop, Tazba said in the second whereas, names first. The deputy lifted his brows. Ma'am? Names, she repeated. Before the paper moves anything, it says who it thinks it is moving. Stiles sniffed. This is irregular. Drought was irregular, Grandmother Willow said. This is deliberate. The deputy surprised everyone by folding the paper down carefully and clearing his throat and saying, Marshal Kendrick sent a cover letter. Says the following names are stakeholders by agreement, Tazba Nez, Grandmother Willow, Len Nez, Naley Nez, Coulter Ash, Tamsin Cobb, Brighton Cobb, the people of Siphon Gulch unnamed but known. He looked up. Also says the Raven is a witness, and if that's a joke I am not allowed to laugh. The Raven lifted one foot and put it down again with the solemnity of a judge sealing something with wax. The deputy's mouth twitched and then disciplined itself. Read, Tazba said. He did. The writ tried to move the trough. It tried to slide the fence. It tried to make the spring into a number. It did this with the politeness of men who steal with folded napkins. Brighton lifted a hand. Before any moving, he said. Add a page. Stiles half turned. Sir? Add the page we wrote, Brighton said. The one with the names. The thirds. The witness by sun and stone. Staple it to your writ so the writ has a mother. Stiles stared at him as if a horse had just quoted Euclid. Then he opened his satchel, took out a small steel spike, slid it through the top corner of the writ and the ledger copy of the water agreement, and hammered it flat with the butt of his pen like a humble blacksmith promoted by circumstances. The deputy started again. The words read different now, like a song with a new harmony behind it. He reached the paragraph where the trough would have marched a rod uphill and stopped. Given the appended agreement, he said, and Tamsin recognized pride disguised as legalese when she heard it, the trough stays where water decides it should be in consultation with those present. Water decides, Grandmother Willow murmured. That is what I have been telling you all since before your hats knew weather. Stiles fidgeted. Brighton stilled him with a single glance. The deputy reached the end and folded the writ exactly in half. That's it, he said. Everything's nailed together that's going to be nailed. Good, Tazba said, and looked beyond the men at the horizon, where dust rose again, not ink dust, not legal dust. Rider dust. Bad dust. The kind you can smell and identify by who it will make into a widow. Reese? Coulter asked, net going rope tight. Reese's friends, Tazba said. The kind who think a man's jail is only as strong as a cousin's spare key. Brighton stepped forward in front of Styles without thinking and then blinked at himself when he found his own body where he had not ordered it to be. He looked at Tazba. She nodded. He stayed. The riders came fast. 4. Scarves up. Hats down. Guns out. They did not slow. They fanned like a rake and then like a whip. One shouted, paper kills slower than we do, and that was all the court they presented. Coulter moved. Brighton moved. Kendrick's deputy lifted his rifle and then put it down because he remembered names and did not want to write his own across a page called accident. Tazba lifted her hands and the world obeyed her choreography because it had learned yesterday and found the steps suited it. Fence, she said. Coulter and Brighton hit the top wire together. The voice of the fence rose, a hawk anger song, and the two leading horses skittered, refusing arguments they had not made. One rider shot wild and clipped the trough. Water jumped. Len hooped and darted in with a bucket as if he had trained all his life for this exact trick, and maybe he had, and caught half of what would have been foolishness and turned it into sense. The second pair of riders tried the draw. Tazba turned her body to put herself between them and the doorway, because when the world needs a thing it will keep needing it until someone says it has had enough. The thin line was sleeping where Reese had learned it. Coulter jerked it once. It woke mean. The horses felt it and reinterpreted loyalty. One went to its knees gently as if apologizing to its own bones and slid. The other jumped and landed wrong and scrambled and recovered, because luck likes a second chance even when men don't deserve it. Brighton fired once. He did not hit a man. He hit a stone exactly where it would ricochet the bullet into a saddle horn and turn a gun rider into a boy holding a hot stick and wondering where his day had gone. Hood appeared from nowhere with a pitchfork and the expression of a man who had decided to assist his future. He planted the tines and used the handle to knock a pistol downward. The pistol fired. The bullet took a button off Styles's vest. Styles stared at the button falling like his own past and then began to laugh, the clean laugh of a man who has just chosen a side and finds it tastes good. The fourth rider made the mistake some men always make, he looked at Tazba's face instead of her hands. He did not see the length of rope uncoiling like a story she had been keeping for a particular kind of day. The loop kissed him off his horse without leaving a bruise he could complain about. He hit the ground, swore a sentence so ugly Grandmother Willow's shawl shivered, and then found the raven on his chest pecking lightly at his courage. Enough, Kendrick's deputy said shakily, rifle now up because comprehension had caught up with his thumb. Throw him down. They did. Not because he asked, but because the math was real and they could see it now, the kind with the thirds and the names and the spiral drawn by an old woman and the line set by a man who had decided to be heavy in the right way. The fight ended with less blood than pride and more relief than either. The riders were sent to town with their hands thinking about cuffs. The trough was hammered tight along its seam and filled again. Styles sewed his button back on with a length of legal thread and a new humility. The deputy finished clearing his throat and asked Tazba, "Ma'am, is there anything you want recorded for the court before I get dry on the way back?" "Yes," Tazba said. "Write this sentence. No man is strong enough for me alone. But a man, a woman, a child, an elder, a horse, a raven, a neighbor, and a fence, together, are strong enough for anything the paper brings." He wrote it. The pencil dug a little. The page kept it. After the men and the dust left, the day gave itself away to evening again. The children napped like saints. The raven took a bath in the trough and came out uglier and happier. The sheep stopped gossiping and went back to the doctrine of chewing. Tamsin leaned on the fence next to Tazba and said, "If you ask me to stay, I will." "I ask," Tazba said. "Every morning until you tell me to stop." "Good," Tamsin said simply. Brighton approached at last, hat in hand in humility trying not to fall off his shoulders. "I don't know how to apologize for yesterday," he said without the smirk he wore like a spur when he didn't know what else to wear. "Or for the day before. Or for the paper that taught me to count and forgot to teach me to look." "Apology is a fence," Tazba said. "It keeps wolves out if you place it and mend it." "Place it." "I am sorry," he said. "And I am grateful." "Good," she said, and stuck out a hand the size of a shovel. He took it and did not wince and did not pretend his hand was bigger. "Bring boards tomorrow," she added. "We're building a shade at the trough. Your men will need a place to learn patience." He smiled. It looked like a beginning and not like a plan. Later, when stars were everywhere and the wind had gone to find someone else to argue with, Tazba and Coulter walked the fence one more time. The thin line lay where it lay. The staples gleamed where they had been driven again. The spiral on the ledger lay on the table in the east-facing room where the map leaned as if learning to read the door. "You said once you pay your water with work," Coulter said. "I paid mine with my back the other day. I'd like to pay with my hands now. And with my name. And with the part of my life I have left that makes sense when it stands next to yours." She looked at him. It is a dangerous thing when a woman like Tazba looks at a man with nothing in her eyes except the truth she has chosen. "Stay," she said for the second time, and the word did not tremble. "I will," he said, and the answer did not perform. It simply was. They stood then without talking and watched the dark hold their place like a cup. Coyote patted the fence line and checked their arithmetic and approved. The Raven slept with one eye open on the ledger because witnesses must never be completely at rest. In the morning, the world would need mending again somewhere. That was the nature of worlds. In the morning, Brighton would arrive with boards and apology number 2, and Styles would bring forms that might or might not deserve their ink, and Kendrick would ride by to check that a balance could last a second day in a country that was invented to break them. In the morning, Len would run and Naley would plant and Grandmother Willow would flip fry bread and add the names of whoever had lived to her long inventory of proof that living was the only argument that ever mattered. For now, the door faced east. For now, the spring sang small and steady and certain. For now, the trough held a moon for anyone who needed to see a whole thing in a broken world. For now, the words she had once believed completely and now believed differently curled inside her chest like a sleeping rope. "No man is strong enough for me. No man alone." She exhaled. The fence hummed. Coulter's hand found hers and did not insist on a promise larger than a night. Somewhere down in the wash, water kissed rock the way old loves learned to do, without showing off, with nothing to prove, with everything to keep. 2 more great stories are next. Don't miss them. Subscribe and turn on notifications.